over is not down the street. It is not around the corner. We are in the middle of it right now. And that's why 7 million Americans in some 2,700 individual protests took the streets on Saturday to send us a message. But I'm not sure that message was heard by the members of this chamber. So I'm here in this chamber tonight to ring the alarm bells and say to my colleagues, both sides of the aisle, the authoritarian takeover is here, it's a violation of our Constitution, and we have to stop it. The experts tell us that there are two ways when there is an authoritarian takeover, when the president becomes a self-appointed king, when a Congress becomes a rubber stamp, when a Supreme Court ignores the Constitution and hands more power to the president. Two ways to keep that authoritarian strongman state from becoming entrenched. The first is for there to be a visible and loud outcry in the first year. The reason that that's important is if there's no outcry, people go, well, this sounds outrageous to me, what just happened. I can't believe the president is trying to tell the networks what shows they can put up. That happens in authoritarian places, but I don't hear any outcries, so is it, maybe, do I misunderstand? Is it that unusual? Oh, the president is suing his own government and asking his Justice Department to find a settlement that will enrich the president. Oh, that seems outrageous. The president is asking his own Justice Department to give the president money? That seems outrageous, but if there's no outcry, maybe it's not that big a deal. Oh, the Secretary of State is throwing students out of this country because of views they expressed on a college campus. That seems extraordinary. Has that ever happened again? Well, nobody's protesting. Maybe I'm wrong to think that we have freedom of speech on our campuses. Oh, the president is weaponizing the Department of Justice to go after people he doesn't like, including proposing the possibility of going after a member of the U.S. Senate. I'm sure that 100 senators would stand up and say, hell no, to such an authoritarian act. What am I missing? If there's no outcry, if there's no protest, then you're in deep trouble. But here in the United States of America, I'm so pleased to say there is an understanding that our freedoms are being crushed. And that's why 7 million people took to the streets on Saturday. I was in Eastern Oregon, and I went to the small town of Lapine. Protests are not a common thing in Lapine, Oregon. It's rural, it's red, but there were 200 people out on the street with all sorts of creative signs and creative costumes. I was really struck by a couple of the veterans I spoke to who said, I fought for my country, and I volunteered and went because I believe in freedom, and our president is crushing those freedoms. And I'm out here to protest and to say what I fought for must not be undone by a president of the United States. Somebody who went and served. That was powerful. I was not drafted in Vietnam. I was too young by a year or two. And I did not volunteer to go. But those who went and come back home and say, our fathers and mothers were engaged in war to defend our freedoms, and I went with this conviction that I wanted to serve my country and defend that special America where we cherish our freedoms and defend our Constitution, I will not see it undone not see it undone by a President of the United States of America, a rubber-stamped Congress, and a court that has decided to find things that don't exist in the Constitution to give power to the executive, that the executive cannot rightfully claim. So that's the first thing that you need in order to keep authoritarian power from becoming entrenched. You need outrage the first year. You need protest the first year. You need protest inside the chamber. You need protest outside the chamber. So people will hear, who are maybe one step away from protesting, they think something's wrong, and they'll go, wow, I didn't go protest, but those 7 million people, they're sending me a message. And that message is, we're in a terrible place in our nation, and we need to be acting. Americans are standing up because the president is not a king. Americans are standing up because laws are not suggestions. Americans are standing up because following the Constitution is not optional. The second way to prevent the entrenchment of authoritarian power is the next election. The scholars really emphasize that because one of the standard things that an authoritarian ruler does is seek to rig the elections so that you won't have the integrity that allows them to be dislodged down the line, or to allow the strongman state to be dislodged by an outcry and vote of the people. You want to rig the next election. Well, that's why the next election matters, because there hasn't been as much time to rig it. The next election for us is November 2026. It's 13 months away. Well, that's still 13 months in which an authoritarian president can work to rig the election, but it's not 3 years out, because in 3 years, an authoritarian president can do a lot more rigging than they can in 13 months. So that next election matters enormously. You get that one chance to win. Don't mess it up. Because with each election, it will get harder and harder to displace the authoritarian structures that are created and strengthened by the strong man in the executive. And when you read by experts saying that this is the authoritarian playbook, watch, they say, for what that authoritarian president is doing, and what you will see is they will work to rig the elections. Okay, well, are we seeing that now? Well, yes, we are. His first tactic, Trump's first tactic to consolidate authoritarian control is to consolidate the state's voter registration files. If you have control over those files, it makes it easier to manipulate them in the next election. Now, we've already seen what some individual states have done to manipulate the voter files. And they've gone on purges and said, let's think about how we can purge the names off this list so people go to the polls and find out they're not even registered to vote. Too late. Well, maybe if there's a whole lot of Hispanic names that are matching, we'll eliminate them. Or maybe we will say, if there's the same name in this state and the same name in the next state, we'll assume that person has moved, so we'll pull them off the polls, off the registration lists. That's actually gone on here. And that's the type of manipulation that can happen across the country if the president has a consolidated national voting registration file. A second tactic is to encourage states to gerrymander their House districts so that you break up, say, a congressional district in a city that perhaps elected a Democrat, since we know that cities tend to be somewhat bluer and rural areas tend to be somewhat redder, and you split it up. And you split it up between a bunch of red districts, and that type of gerrymandering creates disproportional power for the Republican Party. Well, we've seen that happen before. We've seen it often. And in the past, we had a law called the Voting Rights Act that said you couldn't manipulate the congressional districts to destroy the voice of people by race, because race tends to differ according to rural and urban areas as well. But the Supreme Court, hell-bent on accentuating authoritarian power, is considering a case right now that will now not only the type of redistricting that Texas has been undertaking, but will create a constitutional rule that will make it hard to empower the voices of minorities in this country to be represented in the House of Representatives. So the effort to gerrymander even larger numbers of the House in support of an authoritarian state is well underway. And the third tactic is to kill vote by mail. You heard what Trump said. He wants to make it illegal to vote by mail. Now, I'm a senator from Oregon. Oregon invented vote by mail. It actually started with the Republican Party. The Republican Party in my state said, we know that when we encourage people to vote by mail, we get higher turnout, and we're more likely to win campaigns, statewide campaigns, and campaigns for the House, Oregon House, the Oregon Senate. So we're going to go on a big campaign to encourage people to vote by absentee ballot. And the Democrats observed that, and they said, well, they got a point. There is better turnout if you get people to vote by mail, because those folks will not end up failing to vote on Election Day because they forgot, or they had child care, or they couldn't get out of work, or the line was too long. So if you can get them to vote by mail, you're going to have more people vote. So then you had both parties encouraging people to vote by mail. And back in 1998 election, half of the ballots were being cast by mail and half were being cast at the polls. Now, I started my campaign to run for the Oregon House of Representatives in that year, 1998. And I'm a big believer in door knocking. And I just wanted to knock on as many doors as I could and say, here's what matters to our community that's not getting done at the Capitol. I'd like to have your support. And I had a lot of good conversations. But I kind of liked the idea of everyone on Election Day having a big act of the community and going and voting together. That tradition just, it felt good to me. And as I'm knocking on doors and I'm talking to people about the next election, people started saying, well, I'll tell you one thing. I sure do love the ability to vote by mail. And I would say, well, tell me more about that. And they said, well, listen, here's the story. I like to sit down with my husband or sit down with my wife and talk about the candidates. We can read what's in the campaign brochures and discuss it. And I like doing that at our kitchen table. And others said, you know, I really like that vote by mail because I can't get out of work to be able to go vote. And when I do get out of work, I've got child care to pick up, and if you're late for child care, you get charged. So that's a big problem. And I had others who said, you know, here in Oregon we have initiatives, and initiatives are complicated. They're basically creating law not through a legislature, but through a vote of the people. And I really have to understand this stuff. And there's a lot of arguments pro and con in the voters' pamphlet. And so I really like to sit and read through that. And yet others said, you know why I love vote by mail? Because my back hurts and I don't want to stand in line for an hour. And I had others who said, I really like vote by mail because I bring my children to the table and talk to them about what it means to be a citizen in a free country, and that we, the citizens, get to express an opinion. And that opinion counts, because when we fill in that circle, because Oregon, it was done by paper, when we fill in that circle, we are weighing in on the future of our community, on the future of our state, of the future of our country. And I want my children to understand that, yes, you have rights as a citizen, but you also have responsibilities as a citizen. And so as I heard these stories, I thought, well, those are a lot of good points being made. But I'll tell you, those points are not why Trump hates vote by mail. Not at all. The reason he hates vote by mail is because there's such integrity with vote by mail. It is so easy to manipulate Election Day. If you have to go to a precinct and vote, it is so easy to decrease turnout. There are so many strategies that have been so carefully developed over time to prevent people from voting. What do? You change the location of the voting precinct so people are confused about where to go. You put out information about the date and say, sorry you missed the vote, making people think they actually missed the vote when the next vote is actually the next Tuesday. You take and you put machines in that voting precinct that don't work very well to slow down the vote. You understaff the precinct voting location to slow down the vote. All of these tried and true methods for decreasing the vote in places where you don't want people to vote. And President Trump fully understands that. It's easy to manipulate Election Day. When people are worried about the integrity of our election, and they say, we're worried that maybe somebody will vote 2 ballots and vote by mail. Well, we've had audit after audit after audit. The integrity of vote by mail is 1,000 times better than a vote on Election Day where you can manipulate the vote. You put the precinct where there's no parking. That's another strategy. You send intimidators out to make people feel uncomfortable while they're waiting in line. You pass laws that said you can't hand out a glass of water, like Georgia did, so that thirsty people waiting in line give up. You want those wait times to be so long that people give up. And if we thought this was some sort of fantasy, that this doesn't really happen, take Georgia, where we have seen elections where the wait time in urban areas is many hours longer than the wait time in rural areas because of the strategy set up for people to vote, making it difficult for people to vote. That's why Trump hates vote by mail, because it has high integrity. It stops the manipulation. So, here we are, deep into this authoritarian takeover. The president attacking the integrity of our elections, attacking the separation of powers, trying to steal the power of the purse that belongs in that Constitution with us, but grabbing it and saying, I will decide what gets funded. I will defund things through grant cancellations and I will defund by slow walking the dispersion of funds and freezing and impounding and rescissions. I'll use every tactic ever imagined because I want to decide what's funded and what is not funded. Every time you hear the president or one of his cabinet members say, we are defunding that program because it's not in line with the president's priorities, that's an authoritarian statement. The power of the purse in this Constitution, this one right here, belongs with the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate, not the Oval Office. So when the president says he is funding programs he likes and defunding those he doesn't like, he is stealing the constitutional power of the purse. The Supreme Court's weighed in on this twice. President Nixon decided to do this, just simply not disperse funds for programs he didn't like. And so this challenge went to the Supreme Court. Can the president do that? Can the president impound funds? And the Supreme Court resoundingly said, hell no, it's in the Constitution. It couldn't be clearer. The power of the purse rests with the House and Senate, not with the president. Well, that was decided by the Supreme Court in 1975 based on things that were done back in 72, 73, when President Nixon was still in power before he resigned under the Watergate scandal. But then fast forward to 1996. 1996. Realize that we were in the time period between January 95 and January 97, which was the first legislative term for the Gingrich Revolution. And the first agenda item was to do a line item veto. Pass a law saying the president could strike any program he wants, defund it. So the line item veto goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says, did you not read our decision in 1975? Have you not looked at the Constitution of the United States of America? It's in here. It is the people, through their elected representatives, who decide which programs and how much money to give them, not the president. If you want an authoritarian state where the president decides which programs are funded and how much money to give them, you have to go to some other country, because here we have separation of powers. Here we have checks and balances. Here we have a Constitution, and the power of the purse rests with Congress. So we have the 1970s, where the Supreme Court weighed in and said the president cannot impound funds. We have the 1996 issue with a bill that gave line item veto to the president being struck down by the Supreme Court. But here again, more than a quarter century later, we have another president and another majority here in the chamber that wants to ignore the Constitution and hand over the power of the purse to the president. So look at all that we're facing. Every aspect of this authoritarian takeover. The separation of powers being crushed. The power of the purse being transmitted to the president, grabbed by the president. And this chamber doing nothing to stop it. The attack on due process. People being apprehended and deported without hearings. People being stopped on the street because of their accent or their skin color. Attack on the freedom of speech of individuals and by networks, using the coercive power of government to suppress what the free press can write or the free media can put on film or on programs. The attack on law firms as a center of power. The attack on universities as a center of power. the weaponizing of the Justice Department, the effort to mobilize troops into LA and into Portland and into Chicago when nothing is happening that local police can't handle, and there certainly is not a rebellion or an invasion. And a president undermining the integrity of the voting system of the United States of America by attacking vote by mail, by seeking to consolidate and manipulate the voting registration database, by encouraging states to gerrymander in order to have more of one voice than a proportional representation of the population should merit. How is it possible that anyone cannot see that we're in the middle of this authoritarian takeover? Freedoms devastatingly diminished. Government by and for the people replaced by authoritarian strongman power. So I'm here tonight to ring the alarm bells. 7 million Americans who are at protests on Saturday, they're ringing the alarm bells. Let those bells ring so loud, so powerfully, that every citizen hears them. Every elected member of this body hears them. Every member of the House of Representatives hears them and responds by saying, I took an oath to the Constitution, and I'm going to stop this authoritarian takeover. In my town halls, and I hold one in each county each year. I have 36 counties in Oregon. Senator Wyden started this tradition of going to every county, open town hall. When I ran for the Senate, I said I'd do the same thing. I've had well over 600 town halls, except for Senator Wyden, maybe more than anybody among the 100 senators. And I give a short introduction, and then I listen to people. And I start out after that short introduction, I say, Senator Wyden and I are about the only senators who hold town halls like this. And we hold these town halls in Oregon successfully because we have the Oregon way. The Oregon way means that if somebody is speaking that you strongly disagree with, in fact, that person speaking infuriates you, you still listen to that person respectfully, and then we ask that everyone else in the gathering listen respectfully when you're speaking. And so despite incredibly vast differences of opinions on hugely important and often emotional topics, people express their views. And I listen to their views. And Senator Wyden does the same in his town halls. And it affects what we fight for here in the Senate, because we are carrying the hopes and dreams of our citizens into this chamber. We are carrying their aspirations for a better future. And so often that better future is about the fundamentals for families, about a better health care system, about better job opportunities, living wages, an honest day's pay for an honest day's work. Often, it's about education and the hope that education will provide a pathway of opportunity for their children. Health care, housing, education, good paying jobs. I hear a lot about those four issues in my town halls. But you know what I heard this year? I heard something that I have not heard other years. I heard maybe a little of it during the first Trump administration of concern about the checks and balances of our Constitution. Certainly I heard a fair amount of concern and outrage about the stealing of a Supreme Court seat that opened up under President Obama. But this chamber, for the first time in U.S. history, refused to hold a debate and a vote on the nominee from the president. First time in our history, Supreme Court seat stolen. So yes, I did hear some feedback about concerns about our Constitution, our democracy, during Trump's first administration. But nothing like I heard this year. You know, a modest number of people come out to my town halls. It averages about 100 per town hall. Some areas larger, some smaller. In the last year, in 2024, I had about 3,500 people come in person. This year, I had 15,000 plus come, a five-fold increase, come to my town halls. And so many came. Just like the 7 million people who protested on Saturday, so many people came to say, how the hell is the U.S. Senate letting a president crush our freedom and shred our Constitution? And they would say to me, do more. Find some other way to push back, to organize, to persuade your colleagues on both sides of the aisle. The time for action to defend our freedom is now. Not next year, not after the next election, not a month from now. The time is now. And they would say, we see what you've been saying and doing in protest about so much of what's been happening, but you, Senator Merkley, need to do more. And quite frankly, to my colleagues, that's the reason I'm on the floor tonight, trying to think of one more way I can ring the alarm bells, one more way I can use this office and this opportunity afforded to be a member of the U.S. Senate to say, we cannot let this happen. I received another question at those town halls. One town hall after another was, and what can we do to do more? And I said the following. You've asked what everyone can do to do more to save our republic. First, get off the couch. You can't change the future with a pillow over your head. Second, fiercely hold your electeds accountable. Call their phones, write letters, protest outside their offices, fiercely hold them accountable. And me too, hold me accountable as they were in the town hall and as they have when they've been protesting. And join an affinity group, because to be angry and alone is to be depressed. But to be angry and organized with others, that is to be energized and effective. And when it comes to stopping an authoritarian takeover, we need our citizens to be organized, energized, and effective. We need that energy from our citizens as they communicate with us and challenge us. We need that energy in the streets. We need that energy in the halls of power. We need to defend the Constitution. We need to restore our democracy. We need to reinvigorate government of, by, and for the people of the United States of America. And that's why I've come to the floor tonight to ring the alarm bells. Here in the Senate, we've attempted to use a number of tools. Using every hour required under the Senate rules to review the qualifications of unqualified individuals nominated for Trump's cabinet, like Pete Hegseth for defense, and Kristi Noem, and Tulsi Gabbard, and Kash Patel. And so often, my colleagues have said, oh my goodness, I can't even believe the president nominated this individual. But, you know, the president nominated him. He's our leader. So I'll vote for this person. I'll put them in office. To hear my colleagues say they know someone's unqualified, but they're going to vote for him anyway, is to hear the failure to understand our responsibility under the Constitution. Reviewing and voting down individuals who are unqualified by character or talent or experience for a position, that's our responsibility, is to not let them take positions of power where they can do bad things to the American people, where they can undermine the efforts to build a better country. It's our responsibility to exercise our judgment, not to defer to the president. A check and balance means nothing if you say, I'm abandoning my role to evaluate the qualifications, and I will simply vote because the person in the office is of my same party. I voted, I remember one in particular, against one of President Biden's nominees. I was one of only a few folks on my side of the aisle to vote against him. Why? Because I didn't feel the person was suited to the office. And that's my responsibility under the Constitution. One of the people that I felt was vastly unsuited was Russell Vought. As the lead Democrat on the Budget Committee, I therefore had the opportunity to interview Russell Vought before he came to the hearing before the Budget Committee. And he basically told me that his belief was in strongman government, unitary executive. The president should decide what programs are funded and how much they should get, and that he fully expected to use the powers that the president could use to achieve that, involving impoundments, slow walking, frozen funds, and so forth. And I said, but the Supreme Court's weighed in twice, and our Constitution is clear. The power of the purse is here. And he said, you know, I like the unitary executive. That's my philosophy, and that's what I'm going to fight for. I found, therefore, him to be profoundly unsuitable for office because he did not intend to honor the basic premise of the Constitution, that Congress decides by law what is funded and how much. So we had a 30-hour debate. We went through the night here in this chamber debating the merits of this individual. And many of my colleagues had reservations, but in the end, they voted for him. So we have a man controlling the Office of Management and the Budget who said, I think the power of the purse should be with the president, and I'm going to do everything possible to make that happen. By voting for that nominee, we facilitated a crime against the Constitution in which the power of the purse is being taken by the president. We facilitated the authoritarian takeover that is underway right now. My constituents have asked me in those town halls to do everything I can, everything in my power, to stop this authoritarian takeover of our nation. So tonight I've come to the floor to do one thing I have not done before, and that's give a more extended speech, to ring the alarm bells, the speech I'm engaging in right now. We are in the most perilous moment for our Constitution, the biggest threat to our republic since the Civil War. Authoritarianism is not down the street or around the corner. It is clear and present right now. There are a couple of books that I brought with me to explain what's happening. One of them is How Democracies Die. And this book, written by two scholars, Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, they have studied republics around the world that have slid into authoritarian states. And they wrote this book to say, pay attention, America, we're in danger of the same thing happening. And I thought, well, I'll just come and read this book for the benefit of my colleagues who haven't read it, for the benefit of the American people who might be listening in, as one way to ring the alarm bells about the authoritarian takeover of the United States of America and how we are going down the same path that has happened in country after country after country, where you get a rubber-stamped Congress, you get a Supreme Court that hands more power to the executive, you get an ambitious, power-hungry, strongman-style president, and the combination of those three, you have lost your republic. How democracies die. That's what I'm going to share with you tonight. And also another book on tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century by Timothy Snyder. How democracies die. Ours is dying right now with this authoritarian takeover. Tyranny is what you get when you lose your democracy. So, if by going on at some length about this, I can add a little bit of attention, ring the bells a little louder and a little longer, the alarm bells about this authoritarian crushing of our liberties, authoritarian crushing of our freedom, then that's what I'm doing tonight. And at the midnight hour, should I make it that long, still 4 hours from now, I'm going to pause to read some stanzas from Longfellow's poem, Paul Revere's Ride. It's about Paul Revere's ride in April 1775, as he sounded the alarm about military troops marching on American cities. One lantern if the British were attacking by land, 2 lanterns if they were attacking by sea. He rang the alarm bells so that the American colonists could respond and save their colonies, just as I'm attempting to ring alarm bells to say we here in the Senate and in the House have to respond and save our republic. So I'm going to start with the book, How Democracies Die. It's a pretty hefty one. The 2 authors, Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, they are political scientists. They are professors of government. They have spent their careers studying how once stable democracies in Europe, in Latin America, around the world, have collapsed into being strongman states, sometimes gradually and sometimes suddenly. Political parties prioritize their own power over obeying the law. An aggressive president tries to seize more power. Congress becomes a rubber stamp. The courts hand more power to the president, and the president tightens his control. The press softens its criticisms, and other institutions start to tread carefully. These are the 6 warning signs of a democracy in trouble. As the authors of the book warn, most modern democracies don't die suddenly by being overthrown. We all certainly know of cases of that happening, but today, modern democracies generally don't die by being overthrown. Instead, they die as authoritarians erode the institutions and the norms until the checks and balances are gone and you have a strongman state. How Democracies Die was published in 2018 after the first year of Trump's first term. Already these professors were seeing signs of these 6 factors that are the warning symbols of authoritarianism being down the road or on the way. But America did not respond to the warning then, and we are living with the consequences now, because now we are deep in the authoritarian takeover crisis. Between each chapter, I'm going to pause to discuss different ways the Trump administration is trying to tighten its authoritarian grip to turn our government by and for the people into government by and for the powerful. I'm here tonight to ring the alarm bells. The crisis calls on every American, every patriot, every one of us who cherishes our republic to use our heart and nerve and sinew to resist this authoritarian takeover and save our democracy. So let's begin with the introduction. So I'm now reading from the book, and I'll read the introduction and then talk about some other things. It starts out, is our democracy in trouble? Is it in danger? It is a question these are the authors speaking, we never thought we'd be asking. We've been colleagues for 15 years, thinking, writing, teaching students about failures of democracy in other places and times, Europe's dark 1930s, Latin America's repressive 1970s. We spent years researching new forms of authoritarianism emerging around the globe. For us, how and why democracies die has been an occupational obsession. But now, we find ourselves turning in our own country. Over the past 2 years, we have watched politicians say and do things that are unprecedented in the United States, but that we recognize as having been the precursors of democratic crisis in other places. We feel dread, as do so many other Americans, even as we try to reassure ourselves that things can't really be that bad here. After all, even though we know democracies are always fragile, the one in which we live has managed to defy gravity. Our Constitution, our national creed of freedom and equality, our historically robust middle class, our high levels of wealth and education, and our large, diversified private sector, all these should inoculate us from the kind of democratic breakdown that has occurred elsewhere. Yet, we worry. American politicians now treat their rivals as enemies, intimidate the free press, threaten to reject the results of elections. They try to weaken the institutional buffers of our democracy, including the courts, the intelligence services, and the ethics offices. America may not be alone. Scholars are increasingly concerned that democracy may be under threat worldwide, even in places where its existence has been taken for granted. Populist governments have assaulted democratic institutions in Hungary, in Turkey, and in Poland. Extremist forces have made dramatic electoral gains in Australia, France, Germany, the Netherlands, and elsewhere in Europe. And in the United States, for the first time in history, a man with no experience in public office, little observable commitment to constitutional rights, and clear authoritarian tendencies was elected president. What does all of this mean? Are we living through the decline and fall of one of the world's oldest and most successful democracies? Can I remind you, these are the words of the authors, written in 2018, some 7 years ago. They continue. At midday on September 1973, after months of mounting tensions in the streets of Santiago, Chile, British-made Hawker Hunter jets swooped overhead, dropping bombs on La Moneda, the neoclassical presidential palace in the center of the city. As the bombs continued to fall, La Moneda burned. President Salvador Allende, elected 3 years earlier at the head of a leftist coalition, was barricaded inside. During his term, Chile had been racked by social unrest, by economic crisis, by political paralysis. Allende had said he would not leave his post until he had finished his job, but now the moment of truth had arrived. Under the command of General Pinochet, Chile's armed forces were seizing control of the country. Early in the morning on that fateful day, Allende offered defiant words on national radio broadcasts, hoping that many supporters would take to the streets in defense of democracy. But the resistance never materialized. The military police who guarded the palace abandoned him. His broadcast was met with silence. Within hours, President Allende was dead, and so too was Chilean democracy. This is how we tend to think of democracies dying, at the hands of men with guns. During the Cold War, coup d'etat accounted for nearly 3 out of every 4 democratic breakdowns. Democracies in Argentina, Brazil, Dominican Republic, in Ghana, in Greece, in Guatemala, Nigeria, Pakistan and Peru, Thailand, Turkey, and Uruguay all died this way, at the hands of men with guns. More recently, military coups toppled Egyptian President Mohamed Morsi in 2013 and Thai Prime Minister Shinawatra in 2014. In all of these cases, democracy dissolved in spectacular fashion through military power and coercion. But there is another way to break a democracy. It is less dramatic, but equally destructive. Democracies may die at the hands not of generals, but of elected leaders. Presidents or prime ministers who subvert the very process that brought them to power. Some of these leaders dismantled democracy quickly, as Hitler did in the wake of the 1933 Reichstag fire in Germany. More often, though, democracies die slowly, in barely visible steps. In Venezuela, for example, Hugo Chavez was a political outsider who railed against what he cast as a corrupt government elite, promising to build a more authentic democracy that used the country's vast oil wealth to improve the lives of the poor. Skillfully tapping into the anger of ordinary Venezuelans, many of whom felt ignored or mistreated by the established political parties, Chavez was elected president in 1998. As a woman in Chavez's home state of Barinas put it on election night, democracy was infected, and Chavez is the only antibiotic we have. I'm continuing to read from the introduction to How Democracies Die. When Chavez launched his promised revolution, he did so democratically. In 1999, he held free elections for a new constituent assembly, in which his allies won an overwhelming majority. This allowed the Chavistas to single-handedly write a new constitution. It was a democratic constitution, though, and to reinforce its legitimacy, Chavez and his allies won those too, the elections that they held, presidential and legislative, in the year 2000. Chavez's populism triggered intense opposition, and in April 2002, he was briefly toppled by the military. But the coup failed, allowing a triumphant Chavez to claim for himself even more democratic legitimacy. It wasn't until 2003 that Chavez took his first clear steps toward authoritarianism. With public support fading, he stalled an opposition-led referendum that would have recalled him from office until a year later, when soaring oil prices had boosted his standing enough for him to win. In 2004, the government blacklisted those who had signed the recall petition and packed the Supreme Court. I'll just pause a comment here. You start to see how this is evolving here in this description of someone who was elected in fair elections to begin with, but over time starts to bend the different parts of the government, and in this case, proceeding to go after his political enemies, blacklisting those who signed the recall petition, and packing the Supreme Court. But his landslide re-election in 2006 allowed him to maintain a democratic veneer. The Chavista regime grew more repressive after 2006, closing a major television station, arresting or exiling opposition politicians, judges, and media figures on dubious charges, eliminating presidential term limits so that Chavez could remain in power indefinitely. When Chavez, now dying of cancer, was re-elected in 2012, the contest was free but not fair. Chavismo controlled much of the media and deployed the vast machinery of the government in its favor. And after his death a year later, his successor, Nicolas Maduro, won another questionable re-election. And in 2014, his government imprisoned a major opposition leader. Still, the opposition's landslide victory in 2015 seemed to belie critics' claims that Venezuela was no longer democratic. It was only when a new single-party constituent assembly usurped the power of Congress in 2017, nearly 2 decades after Chavez first won the presidency, that Venezuela was widely recognized as an autocracy. This is how democracies now die. Blatant dictatorship in the form of fascism, communism, or military rule has disappeared across much of the world. Military coups and other violent seizures of power are now rare. Most countries hold regular elections. Democracies still die, but by other means. Since the end of the Cold War, most democratic breakdowns have been caused not by generals and soldiers, but by elected governments themselves, like Chavez in Venezuela. Elected leaders have subverted democratic institutions in Georgia, in Hungary, in Nicaragua, in Peru, in the Philippines, in Poland, in Russia, Sri Lanka, Turkey, and Ukraine. Democratic backsliding today begins at the ballot box. The electoral road to breakdown is dangerously deceptive. With a classic coup d'etat, as in Pinochet's Chile, the death of a democracy is immediate and evident to all. The presidential palace burns. The president is killed, imprisoned, or shipped into exile. The Constitution is suspended or scrapped. On the electoral road, however, none of those things happen. There are no tanks in the streets. Constitutions and other nominally democratic institutions remain in place. People still vote. Elected autocrats maintain a veneer of democracy while eviscerating its substance. Many government efforts to subvert democracy are, quote, legal, in the sense that they are approved by the legislature or accepted by the courts. They may even be portrayed as efforts to improve democracy, making the judiciary more efficient, combating corruption, cleaning up the electoral process. Newspapers still publish, but are bought off or bullied into self-censorship. Citizens continue to criticize the government, but often find themselves facing tax or other legal troubles. This sows public confusion. People do not immediately realize what is happening. Many continue to believe they are living in a democracy. In 2011, when a Latino Barometro survey asked Venezuelans to rate their own country from 1, not at all democratic, to 10, completely democratic. 51% of respondents gave their country a score of 8 or higher, meaning they weighed in, saying the country looks pretty democratic. Because there is no single moment, no coup, no declaration of martial law, no suspension of the Constitution, in which the regime obviously crosses the line into dictatorship. Nothing sets off society's alarm bells, and those who denounce government abuse may be dismissed as exaggerating or crying wolf. Democracy's erosion is, for many, almost imperceptible. The authors continue in this introduction. How vulnerable is American democracy to this form of backsliding? The foundation of our democracy is certainly stronger than those in Venezuela or Turkey or Hungary. But are they strong enough? Answering such a question requires stepping back from daily headlines and breaking news alerts to widen our view, drawing lessons from the experiences of other democracies around the world and throughout history. Studying other democracies in crisis allows us to better understand the challenges facing our own democracy. For example, based on the historical experience of other nations, we, the authors, have developed a litmus test to help identify would-be autocrats before they come to power. We can learn from mistakes that past democratic leaders have made in opening the door to would-be authoritarians, and conversely, from the ways that have kept extremists out of power. A comparative approach also reveals how elected autocrats in different parts of the world employ remarkably similar strategies to subvert the democratic institutions. As these patterns become visible, steps toward breakdown grow less ambiguous and easier to combat. Knowing how citizens in other democracies have successfully resisted elected autocrats, or why they tragically failed to do so, is essential to those seeking to defend American democracy today. We know that extremist demagogues emerge from time to time in all societies, even in healthy democracies. The United States has had its share of them, including Henry Ford and Huey Long and Joe McCarthy and George Wallace. An essential test for democracies is not whether such figures emerge, but whether political leaders, and especially political parties, work to prevent them from gaining power in the first place by keeping them off mainstream party tickets, refusing to endorse or align with them, and when necessary, making common cause with rivals in support of our democratic candidates. Isolating popular extremists requires political courage. But when fear, opportunism, or miscalculation leads established parties to bring extremists into the mainstream, democracy is imperiled. Once a would-be authoritarian makes it to power, democracies face a second critical test. Will the autocratic leader subvert democratic institutions or be constrained by those institutions? Institutions alone are not enough to rein in elected autocrats. Constitutions must be defended by political parties and organized citizens, but also by democratic norms. Without robust norms, constitutional checks and balances do not serve as the bulwarks of democracy we imagine them to be. Institutions become political weapons, wielded forcefully by those who control them against those who do not. This is how elected autocrats subvert democracy, packing and weaponizing the courts and other neutral agencies, buying off the media and the private sector, or bullying them into silence, and rewriting the rules of politics to tilt the playing field against opponents. The tragic paradox of the elected route to authoritarianism is that democracy's assassins use the very institutions of democracy gradually, subtly, and even legally to kill it. America failed the first test in November 2016 when we elected a president with dubious allegiance to democratic norms. Again, I'm reading from the book by these two scholars. Donald Trump's surprise victory is made possible not only by public disaffection, but also by the Republican Party's failure to keep an extremist demagogue within its own ranks from gaining the nomination. How serious is the threat now? Written in 2018. Many observers take comfort in our Constitution, designed precisely to thwart and contain demagogues. Our Madisonian system of checks and balances has endured for more than 2 centuries. It survived the Civil War, the Great Depression, the Cold War. It survived Watergate. Surely then it will survive Trump. We are less certain. Historically, our system of checks and balance has worked pretty well, but not or not entirely because of the constitutional system designed by the founders. Democracies work best and survive longer when constitutions are reinforced by unwritten democratic norms. 2 basic norms have preserved America's checks and balances in ways that we have often taken for granted. Mutual toleration, or the understanding that competing parties accept one another as legitimate, and forbearance, or the idea that politicians should exercise restraint in deploying their institutional prerogatives. These 2 norms undergirded American democracy for most of the 20th century. Leaders of the 2 major parties accepted one another as legitimate and resisted the temptation to use their temporary control of institutions to maximize partisan advantage. Norms of toleration and restraint served as the soft guardrails of American democracy, helping it avoid the kind of partisan fight to the death that has destroyed democracies elsewhere in the world, including Europe in the 30s and South America in the 1960s and the 1970s. Today, however, the guardrails of American democracy are weakening. The erosion of our democratic norms began in the 1980s and 1990s and accelerated in the 2000s. By the time Barack Obama became president, many Republicans questioned the legitimacy of their Democratic rivals and had abandoned forbearance for a strategy of winning by any means necessary. Donald Trump may have accelerated this process, but he didn't cause it. The challenges facing American democracy run deeper. The weakening of our democratic norms is rooted in extreme partisan polarization, one that extends beyond policy differences into existential conflict over race and culture. American efforts to achieve racial equality as our society grows increasingly diverse have fueled an insidious reaction and intensifying polarization. And if one thing is clear from studying breakdowns throughout history, it's the extreme polarization that can kill democracies. There are, therefore, reasons for alarm, say the authors. Not only did Americans elect a demagogue in 2016, but we did so at a time when the norms that once protected our democracy were already coming unmoored. But if other countries' experiences teach us that polarization can kill democracies, they also teach us that breakdown is not inevitable. It is not irreversible. Drawing lessons from other democracies, our book suggests strategies that citizens should and should not follow to defend our democracy. Many Americans are justifiably frightened by what is happening to our country. But protecting our democracy requires more than fright, more than outrage. It must be humble and bold. We must learn from other countries to see the warning signs and recognize the false alarms. We must be aware of the fateful missteps that have wrecked other democracies. And we must see how citizens have risen to meet the great democratic crises of the past, overcoming their own deep-seated divisions to avert breakdown. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. The promise of history and the hope, the authors say, of their book is that we find the rhymes before it is too late. There are two key points in that introduction that we have been accustomed to thinking of democracies failing through a military coup. So as long as there is not a military coup, as long as the presidential palace is not burned, as long as troops don't march in the street and the Constitution is not thrown out and replaced by martial law, we're fine. But the second key point is that that is not the way democracies die today, is not by martial law, not by military coups, not, as the authors put it, by men with guns. Democracies die today by elected leaders, augmenting their power in an authoritarian quest, developing additional momentum from a rubber-stamped Congress, gaining further power from decisions handed down by a court, and then using the institutions of the government. Since returning to office in January, President Trump has willfully and continually broken the law. The path for this lawbreaking was clear before Trump returned to office. On July 1st, 2024, the Supreme Court's conservative majority found invisible ink in our Constitution. It says presidents have absolute immunity for committing crimes if they are done as official acts. The Brennan Center for Justice said of this ruling, quote, unfounded in both history and legal precedent, the decision poses a risk to our system of governance. I'm going to share with you their analysis of that ruling. This is the ruling, Trump versus the United States, that I commented on earlier, in which I said the Supreme Court has decided that the president is a king, immune from prosecution for committing crimes as long as they do it as an act of government. And once again, I'll emphasize that when this was going to the court, I said there is no way that our Supreme Court says the president is above the law. No way that he's immune for prosecution for crimes committed, because our founders were terrified of the president being immune from the law. They were terrified of a president being a king. And they like to say they're originalists. And if you look at the original context, it's so emphasized in every possible way that the checks and balances were designed to make sure that the president was not a king, that the vision for the country was hammered out in legislation crafted by people elected to serve in the House and serve in the Senate. And the president was to execute those laws, was to implement those laws, not to act as the sole power, crafting the vision, deciding what programs to fund, deciding how much money to give them, and over here, Congress is just a rubber stamp. And they certainly, the founders, never envisioned that the president was above the law. How the Supreme Court found invisible ink in the Constitution, I do not know. But here's an analysis by the Brennan Center of this decision. Written October 1st, 2024. Titled, The Supreme Court's Presidential Immunity Ruling Undermines Our Democracy. So again, this is before Trump was reelected in November, before he came back here in January 2025. The ruling in Trump versus the United States is an affront to democracy and the rule of law, forfeiting critical checks on executive power. It undermines criminal accountability, or it undermines criminal accountability for presidents if their lawbreaking occurs in the course of official conduct. It endangers democratic accountability by potentially shielding presidents from prosecution for trying to overthrow elections. By inserting this opinion into a world where impeachment is no longer a viable option, the Supreme Court is licensing future presidents to subvert our democracy at will and protecting a past president, Donald Trump, who attempted just that. The majority of the justices in this opinion claim the court's ruling restores the founders' design for an energetic executive, but this distorts the founders' understanding of executive power in our constitutional democracy. They concentrated power in the hands of a single executive to make it easier to hold presidents accountable and to ensure there would be no buck passing for executive decisions. Presidents would have to be responsive to the voters or risk losing office. And the founders determined that presidents would have no criminal immunity, so they could be prosecuted if they violated the law. These foundational decisions ensured that whether by Congress, the courts, or the people, presidents could be held to account, as they should be in any country that values the rule of law. Ignoring this history, the High Court went to great lengths to shield presidents from accountability. It gave them a combination of absolute and presumptive immunities that applied to all so-called official acts. This practically invites future presidents to use the levers of the federal government to commit crimes. That's absurd and intolerable. But let's not disregard the potential retroactive effect. This decision may also let a former president off the hook for his flagrantly anti-democratic behavior. Trump is accused of attempting to overturn the 2020 election, essentially anointing himself by invalidating the choices of millions of voters. The court's ruling complicates the case against him considerably. It directed federal prosecutors to drop allegations tied to Trump's commandeering of the Department of Justice, and it requires the prosecutors to overcome a daunting presumption that Trump has immunity for much of the rest of his scheme. In doing so, it increases the risk that Trump may walk free, but that cannot be the outcome. Any opinion from the court that allows that is war with our system of self-government, a direct threat to our democracy itself. So the Supreme Court found something in our Constitution that no one else has been able to find over almost 250 years. Of course, our Constitution came 11 years after our Declaration of Independence. So let's say 240 years. 240 years, presidents accountable to the law, be prosecuted for crimes, and then suddenly in 2024, the Supreme Court said, we want to give immunity. We think it's good policy to give the president immunity. They said things like they didn't want the president to have to worry about whether they're breaking the law, so we'll just decide the president's immune to the law. You know, the Supreme Court's not supposed to make law. They're supposed to enforce the Constitution. But they designated themselves based on their judgment that it'd be a good thing for the president to be immune from potential prosecution, to just give him that power. They could have said, in their opinion, we think it might be good practice, so even though the Constitution doesn't say it, we encourage Congress to take a look at this possible policy improvement. And I think we would have sat here, Democrats and Republicans together, and said, who are you kidding? We've read the Constitution. We've taken an oath to the Constitution. There is no clause in Article 2 of the Constitution that says the president's immune from prosecution or that the president is above the law. And if you combine that power of the president to commit a crime with the power to also give pardons for anyone in the executive branch who is executing decisions of the president, you now have an entire executive branch that feels empowered to operate outside the law. Well, that's about where we are now. Combined immunity with the president's pardon power, and the entire executive branch believes it can operate outside of the law. And operating outside the law is exactly what we've seen. On January 20th, I sat in the rotunda of the Capitol, just down the hall from these double doors to my right, situated halfway between the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate, for Donald Trump's inaugural address. It was not a traditional address in which a president lays out a vision. A traditional address, the president says, here is the vision I laid out for the country when I was campaigning, and now I'm going to work with Congress to implement this vision. And the reason the president says that is because the Constitution places the power to decide the direction of the country with Congress. What programs to fund and at what level to fund them. Power is placed with Congress. So to execute the vision from the campaign, presidents say, and I'm going to work with Congress. I'm going to work with both sides in Congress to build that future that I promised in my campaign. Instead, in his speech, Trump talked about ruling by executive order, governing by executive order, governing by fiat. Nothing about working with Congress to achieve the vision. He issued 26 executive orders on his first day. He's issued more than 200 from that inauguration in January till now. Many of these orders have directly violated our country's legal statutes. It is a vision of government where power flows not from the law, but from President Trump. He fired 17 inspectors general, violating the law that allows the president to fire an inspector general only for cause and with 30 days' notice to Congress. Let me read you an article when these firings happened in January. The title is Fired Inspectors General Raise Alarms as Trump's Administration Moves to Finalize the Purge, written by Charlie Savage on January 27th of this year. The Trump administration on Monday ordered former staff members for as many as 17 fired inspector general to immediately arrange for the return of work laptops, phones, parking decals, and ID cards, even as questions remained over whether President Trump broke the law in dismissing these independent watchdogs. Some of the fired officials were seeking to raise alarms about what had happened. Among them was Mark Greenblatt, whom Trump had appointed as Inspector General of the Interior Department 5 years ago, and who had led an interagency council of the watchdog officials until the new year. This raises an existential threat with respect to the primary independent oversight function in the federal government, Mr. Greenblatt said. We have preserved the independence of inspectors general by making them not swing with every change of a political party. He warned the credibility of the inspectors would be at issue if Mr. Trump put in lackeys who are rubber stamping his programs and exonerating allegations for his own people willy-nilly. Doing so would give the next Democratic president an incentive to fire them all too, setting off a never-ending cycle of politicization. Aboard Air Force One on Saturday, the article continues, Mr. Trump defended the purge. Some people, he said, quote, some people thought that some were unfair or some were not doing the job, he said, falsely claiming that a mass removal of inspectors general was a very standard thing to do. That is not true. While it is the case that after Congress enacted the Inspector General Act in 1978, and President Ronald Reagan removed all those he inherited from President Jimmy Carter in 1981, he later rehired some of them, and since then the norm has been they remain in place when new presidents take office, underscoring their role as nonpartisan officials. Even as word began to seep out late Friday into the weekend that the White House had tersely dismissed officials, citing its, quote, changing priorities, it had not released a comprehensive list of who had been fired, leading to confusion about the extent of the purge. In an interview on Monday, Hannibal Ware, who goes by Mike and who took over as chair of the Interagency Council in January and was among those fired, said the dismissals he knew of extended to 17 officials covering 18 agencies. He had held the watchdog role for 2 agencies, one of which was in an acting capacity. The agencies were, he said, the Departments of Ag, Commerce, Defense, Education, Energy, Health and Human Services, Housing, Urban Development, Interior, Labor, State, Transportation, Treasury, and Veterans Affairs. They also included, he said, an Inspector General for the Afghanistan Reconstruction and the internal watchdogs at the Environmental Protection Agency, the White House's Office of Personnel Management, and Mr. Ware's own 2 agencies, Small Business Administration and Social Security Administration. But underscoring the confusion, at least one of those inspectors, Krista Boyd of the Office of Personnel Management, found herself locked out of a system even though she had not received an email informing her that she'd been fired, according to people familiar with the matter. The Inspector General community is assuming that she also was terminated. In response to this purge, Mr. Ware, in a letter to the White House late Friday, suggested the firings were illegal because they violated a law that requires giving Congress 30 days advance notice with the reason for any removal of an Inspector General. Congress passed the Inspector General Act as part of the wave of post-Watergate reforms to government. The idea was to have officials embedded in major parts of the executive branch who did not report to that department or agency's head until they're able to perform independent internal oversight. In 2020, Mr. Trump summarily ousted or sidelined a series of inspectors general seen as investigating his administration aggressively. Partly in response to that, Congress strengthened the 30-day notice law by requiring presidents to provide a substantive rationale, including a detailed, case-specific reason for a firing. In an interview, Mr. Ware warned the administration could flout part of the Inspector General Act, then it would establish that it need not abide by the rest of the law, including provisions requiring giving watchdogs unfettered access to agency files. Quote, what strength is there in the Inspector General Act if they say they don't have to abide by parts of it, he asked. This is a threat to our democracy. Mr. Missel, who was removed as the IG for the Department of Veteran Affairs, pointed to Congress as a potential defense of the institution. He said, for Inspector General to continue to improve government services and ensure taxpayer funds are spent effectively, they must continue to be truly independent and have the support of Congress. In a letter over the weekend, the ranking Democrats on the House Oversight Committee said the following: this attempt to unlawfully and arbitrarily remove more than a dozen independent, nonpartisan inspectors general without notice to Congress and in the dead of night is a blatant violation of law. It should disturb all of us that one of the first acts of this administration on this path to authoritarian control of our nation was to throw out those independent watchdogs. That, in fact, is a common symptom of an authoritarian takeover. Get rid of the inspectors. In this case, Congress, all of us, has strengthened the law to make their require not just notice, but a specific act, an egregious act to be fired, so that they really could feel independent, not accountable to the head, and could report things honestly. I know in my work here over the last 17 years, I have repeatedly read Inspector General's reports, and they have often been some of the most insightful examinations of what is going right and what is going wrong, and given us as legislators ideas for things that need to be fixed. But you can't have that type of valuable input if the Inspector Generals are not independent. If they're worried that the first critical thing they say or point out, they will be fired. Now, it was also reported the Trump administration blocked funding for the Council of Inspectors General on integrity and efficiency. Block the funding for those who are dedicated to integrity and efficiency. Now let me share with you some reporting from just a week ago. And it's titled, Trump Administration Defunds the Federal Watchdog Office. The White House last week informed a federal office charged with conducting oversight of the Trump administration that it was blocking congressionally approved money for its operations for the coming fiscal year, effectively shuttering it after midnight on Tuesday. The blocked funds are not linked to the funding showdown between congressional Democrats and Republicans that could prompt a government shutdown. The decision to fund the Council of the Inspectors General on Integrity and Efficiency, which drew quick condemnation from top Republicans in the Senate who are now pressing to reverse it, was the latest effort by the White House to undermine independent investigators in the federal government. It was also an end run around Congress by a White House that has repeatedly sought to usurp legislative branch's power over federal spending. The move would shut down an umbrella office that supports the government's 72 inspectors general, could wipe out a public website where they post their reports, which includes a repository of decades of recommendations on how the government could save money. In a letter on Monday, Senators Collins, Republican of Maine, and Chairwoman of the Appropriations Committee, and Chuck Grassley, Republican of Iowa, Chair of the Judiciary, called on the White House to release the funding. Absent immediate action, they wrote, the Watchdog Office will furlough staff and terminate important functions that help prevent and detect waste, fraud, and abuse throughout the government. So I appreciate that my two colleagues weighed in that fashion, because this entire operation attacking the Inspector Generals is the exact opposite of what Trump said he wanted to achieve through DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency. The Inspector Generals report when things are going wrong, and they report when things are going right. They provide suggestions on how things can be fixed. So if you really want to have a Department on Government Efficiency, one of the first things you would do is strengthen the Inspector Generals, not undermine them. If, on the other hand, you want to run the government in an authoritarian fashion, you don't want people keeping an eye on what you're doing and reporting it to Congress or reporting it to the American people. So you fire the inspectors. In addition to the firings of the Inspector Generals, Trump and Vogt, V-O-U-G-H-T, our current head of OMB, and Elon Musk, fired federal workers who provide critical services. Politico did a report on how the cuts to the Forest Service increase wildfire risk. And the article is titled, Crazy, Forest Service Cuts Ignite Fear and Fury Over Wildfire Risks. Now I come from the west part of the country. The West is besieged every year by wildfires. We used to think of them as the summer wildfires, but now in Oregon they can be in the spring or the summer or the fall. And further south in California, they can be any month of the year. The wildfire seasons are getting longer because with climate change, our forests are drier. We also have more lightning strikes, often more wind, that fuels the fires from an initial small fire into a large conflagration. So whenever the infrastructure for fighting fires or treating the forest to reduce the risk of fire in the first place is assaulted, we get a little worried out west. But here is what the Politico article said. Officials from Nevada to New Jersey to Utah and beyond are scrambling to take stock of President Donald Trump's cuts to the U.S. Forest Service, deciding how to respond as the summer wildfire season looms. Forest fires aren't going to take 4 years off just because of who's in the White House, said Colorado Governor Polis in an interview following the announcement of a $7 million cut in state wildfire mitigation grants. So it's really important that states up the bar on preparation. Trump has cut 10% of the workers at the Forest Service, an agency that manages 193 million acres of national forests and grasslands, with more firings and a steep reorganization likely coming. About 75% of the agency staff are trained in wildland firefighting. That means there are fewer workers across the country clearing brush, thinning trees, we call this forest management, to reduce the risk and intensity of wildfires. And when fires do break out, there will be fewer workers to stop the spread of the fire. The cuts have prompted alarm bells in state capitals as attention on wildfires and forestry policy has arguably never been higher in the wake of devastating fires that ripped through Los Angeles earlier this year. Record drought, heat waves, sluggish prevention work have exacerbated fires in recent decades. An average of 3 million acres burned nationwide each year in the 1990s, but now the average is nearly 7 million acres per year, according to the National Interagency Fire Center. Now, with that critical prevention work at risk of slowing, states and cities are weighing drastic actions to safeguard against the threat of potentially more fire-prone national lands, since fire doesn't respect federal, state, or private land boundaries. Nevada State Forester and Fire Warden Casey told Politico, "We're going to be headed into what could be a big fire season in the state of Nevada," adding that she can exercise emergency hiring authority if needed. The federal government owns 86% of Nevada's land. "I'm nervous about our ability to maintain those public lands with the people who work on the ground doing the important critical work that actually helps lessen the risk of catastrophic loss from fire. The shrinking of the Forest Service is hitting the agency both on the ground and at the leadership level, with Biden-era Chief Randy Moore retiring in the wake of mass layoffs and more half the regional heads also departing." The article goes on at some length. I'm going to spare you from the rest of it because the point is quite clear. Massive cuts to the Forest Service were creating enormous danger of increased fires in the West. These firings were often in complete violation of the law. There is a law called the RIF law, the Reduction in Force law, and it lays out a very, very careful analysis that has to go on to make sure that when you do reduce the size of an agency, that you do it in a manner that produces the best possible results. And if you do the firings without that process, that is illegal. So fire inspector generals, without notice, broke the law. Firing them without cause broke the law. Firing forest workers without a proper RIF analysis broke the law. Trump also proceeded to fire the board members of independent agencies, violating laws that establish the terms of office and violating the laws that allow them to be fired only for cause. He violated the Anti-Deficiency Act when Elon Musk and Doge sent the fork-in-the-road email to 2 million federal employees, offering a buyout with pay through September 30th. He violated the Privacy Act when Trump, Musk, and the Doge accessed sensitive personal information from computers of the Social Security Administration. He violated a 2018 law banning reductions in indirect costs covered by NIH research grants when he capped those rates at 15%. Trump issued an executive order ending birthright citizenship, which is in our Constitution. It was quickly blocked by a federal judge. Trump is routinely bypassing the Senate's confirmation process by making interim appointments of U.S. attorneys around the country in clear violation of the intent and requirements of the law. Now, in this government shutdown, he's breaking several laws by using nonpartisan government agencies to amplify his political messaging. I'll read to you a letter that senators sent, including myself, to the administration, to Russ Vought, the Director of the Office of Management and Budget. My point in all of these pieces, all of these different actions, from the inspector generals being fired to board members being tossed, all in violation of the laws concerning the executive branch, is that we have an authoritarian president who acts and believes that he is beyond the law, not accountable to the law, and as a strong man can do whatever the hell he wants. It's our responsibility to say, hell no. We have a Constitution. We took an oath to that Constitution. It's our responsibility to pass legislation that patches in any gray areas, to make things clear. If the courts say it's not quite clear, we need to make it clear, but we're not doing that. So this letter, in regard to the use of nonpartisan government agencies for political messaging, is an important accounting of trying to hold the administration to the rule of law. Director Vought. As Congress continues to work on funding the federal government for fiscal year 2026, the White House and political appointees assigned to agencies within the executive branch have been engaged in widespread campaign of partisan political activities. These activities are in blatant violation of Section 715 of Public Law 11847, which prohibits federal funds from being used for propaganda purposes designed to support or defeat legislation pending before Congress. These activities appear to violate the Anti-Lobbying Act and the Hatch Act. We urge you to immediately remove these illegal, partisan messages to comply with the law and hold accountable those who have directed this behavior. As early as September 30th, 2025, federal agencies began publicly posting various notices and other media from official accounts on official websites in official email correspondence that violate 715's prohibition on propaganda. For example, the official website of the Department of Housing and Urban Development displayed a blatantly partisan political banner on their website claiming that, quote, the radical left are going to inflict massive pain on the American people. This is partisan political messaging done on government websites. Violation of the Anti-Lobbying Act, violation of the Hatch Act, violation of 715 of Public Law 11847. On October 1st, similar partisan political messages appear on the websites for the Small Business Administration, the Department of Justice, the Department of Ag, among others. In addition to website updates, federal employees, including the Small Business Administration, Department of Labor, Department of Education, Department of Veterans Affairs, were reportedly directed to set automatic reply email messages with partisan political propaganda which asserts that, quote, Democratic senators are blocking passage of H.R. 5371 in the Senate, which has led to a lapse in appropriations, end of quote. As you well know, these messages are misleading, given that Democrats have voted 4 times over the past week to fully fund the government, only to be rebuffed by our Republican colleagues. But more important, they are clear violations of Section 715, which prohibits the use of federal funds by an agency to publicly support or oppose legislation before the Congress. Spirited public debate has its place, but agency resources, including websites or emails, should not be used to send overtly political, and in this case, misleading messages to the American people. Congress has long enacted laws to ensure partisan political activities and propaganda do not impede the government's ability to serve all Americans. Given the blatant, systematic, and repeated violations of Section 715 of Public Law 11847 and likely violations of the Anti-Lobbying and Hatch Acts over the last week, you must immediately remove these partisan messages from all executive branch agency communications and websites. I never thought I'd see the day that a president of the United States would use the instruments of the government to run a blatant political campaign, saying we're blaming this party or that group for this outcome. That so undermines the vision of an executive branch elected to serve all the people of the United States. So undermines the vision that we do not politicize the functions of the executive branch. The way that they operate, the programs they support, the levels at which they're funded, all of those things will, of course, change according to laws that we pass here. But political messages, blatant political attacks, campaign slogans on official websites is against the law, and another law that the president is breaking. In March, The Atlantic published a piece titled, "America is Watching the Rise of the Dual State." And it describes how another authoritarian regime, quote, maintained a day-to-day normalcy for many of its citizens while at the same time establishing a domain of lawlessness. It's a sizable article. So for now, I'm not going to read all of it to you, but I will read the first part, because what this is about is Germany in the 1930s. Again, this article published by The Atlantic. And how we in America are following a path that has chilling parallels. Chilling parallels. On September 20th, 1938, a man who had witnessed the rise of fascism packed his suitcases and fled his home in Berlin. He arranged to have smuggled separately a manuscript that he had drafted in secret over the previous 2 years. This book was remarkable. It clarified what was unfolding in Berlin at the time, the catalyst for the author's flight. The man fleeing was a Jewish labor lawyer named Ernst Fraenkel. He completed his manuscript 2 years later at the University of Chicago, published it as the book The Dual State, with the modest subtitle, A Contribution to the Theory of Dictatorship. The book explains how the Nazi regime managed to keep on track a capitalist economy governed by stable laws and maintain a day-to-day normalcy for many of its citizens, while at the same time establishing a domain of lawlessness and state violence in order to realize its terrible vision of ethno-nationalism. Fraenkel offered in this book a simple, powerful picture of how the Constitution and legal foundations of the Weimar Republic eroded and were replaced by strongman-style rule in which the commands of the Nazi Party and its leader became paramount. His perspective was not grounded in abstract political theory. It grew instead from his experience as a Jewish lawyer in Nazi Berlin, representing dissidents and other disfavored clients. Academic in tone, the Dual State book sketches a template of emerging tyranny distilled from bloody and horrifying experience. As Frankl explained it, a lawless dictatorship does not arise simply by snuffing out the ordinary legal system of rules, procedures, and precedents. To the contrary, that system, which he called the normative state, remains in place while dictatorial power spreads across society. What happens, he explained, is insidious. Rather than completely eliminating the normative state, the state of what normal citizens experience day to day, the Nazi regime created a parallel zone in which unlimited arbitrariness and violence unchecked by legal guarantees reigned freely. This is what Frankl called the prerogative state, where ordinary law didn't apply. In this prerogative state, judges and other legal actors deferred to the racist hierarchies and ruthless expediencies of the Nazi regime. The key here is that this prerogative state does not immediately and completely overrun the normative state. I'll just summarize my impression about this article, because I think it's a little too fancy in its political science depictions, almost loses comprehensibleness. And that is, witnessed were around the executive in the Weimar Republic, there started to become a zone of lawlessness in which the laws were not followed, because it became an authoritarian regime that says, we decide, we are the executive, we decide what we do. We don't care what those laws say that tell us how we're supposed to act. We ignore them. Meanwhile, maintaining a relatively normal economy in the day-to-day lives of people. What I have gone through in law violation after law violation after violation after violation in just January through October of this year is the executive of the United States creating that zone around the executive where the laws don't apply. They don't apply because Trump chooses to ignore them. And in choosing to ignore them, he is effectively creating that zone around the executive that doesn't operate on this foundation that we have honored for 2.5 centuries, a foundation in which the president is accountable to the law and the people who work for the president are accountable to the law. That is the chilling parallel between 1930s Germany and now, of an authoritarian executive creating a zone of lawlessness around the executive function. In addition to the lawlessness, we have also been so affected by the legislation that has passed here in this chamber. Now, these are two different components of an administration that has decided that it is a families lose, billionaires win perspective. The laws that apply to the executive routinely ignored. I've gone through about a dozen of them in this presentation. And then championed legislation that harms Americans. Those two things, one undermining our Constitution and establishing a strongman state, using that kind of authoritarian executive power to persuade the majority in the House and Senate to pass a law by the narrowest of margins. I think the vote here in the Senate was broken by the Vice President in passing that bill, convincing them to pass a law that hurts Americans. And now Republicans have shut down the government in order to preserve that attack on health care. And why did they want to shut down health care or savage or shred health care? To give more tax breaks to billionaires. Slash nutrition programs to give tax breaks to billionaires. Slash the tax credits to give more tax breaks to billionaires. Slash Medicaid healthcare programs to give more tax breaks to billionaires. And on top of all that, add $30 trillion to the projected debt of the United States of America to give tax breaks to the richest Americans. $30 trillion additional debt. You know, I've often been confounded by the rhetoric on the right, which says they are fiscally responsible because our debt has been driven up time and time again by the decisions they championed. We have the Bush tax cuts, created massive federal debt. We have a second Bush tax cut, created massive federal debt. We have the war on Afghanistan and Iraq, creating massive debt. And we certainly have this most recent decision to savage programs for Americans and run up $30 trillion more in debt, according to the estimates of the Congressional Budget Office, in order to fund those tax breaks for the richest Americans. Well, we are now at 100% of debt to GDP, gross domestic product. So if you put on one side of the scale the size of our economy and you put on the other side of the scale our debt, they are the same. We're at 100%. And that starts to become a perilous economic position for the United States. Perilous because the further you go in that direction, you run up more and more and more debt. What the budget is doing right now in order to provide these tax breaks, and I speak roughly, I think we are at about 17% of GDP in revenue and about 23% of gross domestic product in spending, a 6% gap. And the Republicans just passed a bill that makes it far worse and runs up far more debt. Certainly nothing fiscally responsible in that. They didn't run up debt to make our health care system better. They savaged the health care for Americans, the United States of America, in order to fund tax breaks for billionaires. But the tax breaks were so generous, cutting the health care programs didn't start to pay for it, so they run up another $30 trillion in debt, according to the Congressional Budget Office. The impact of this health care bill on Oregonians is significant. It's projected to increase the average payment on the exchange, the average net premium paid, by about 68%. Now that's actually, if that comes out to be true, that's a hell of a lot better than the average across the country, because the predicted average across the country is 114%, more than doubling. So I guess Oregonians might say, hey, we did a little better, but I'll tell you, any family that finds they didn't get a 5% increase in their health care cost or 10%, they got a 68%, $1,300 a person, they are going to struggle, and they are going to go without insurance. in many cases, and they are going to end up with worse health care as a result because they won't go to the doctor because they don't have insurance to pay for it. And if they do go to the doctor, when a condition becomes bad enough, a small condition may become a really serious condition. A treatable condition may become an untreatable condition. An early tumor may become a death sentence tumor. And it'll be more expensive to treat that health care because the disease is worse and it's being treated in the emergency room, the most expensive place to treat a health condition. And then we have the fact that without insurance, they won't be able to pay the bills that they receive, so the clinic and the hospital will receive less funds. And in receiving less funds, they would have to reduce the amount of services they provide in the community, affecting everybody's health care. The Sheps Center estimates that 300-plus rural hospitals are at risk to close because of the big, ugly betrayal bill passed by the majority party. You can sum it up this way. The bill is all about the red carpet for billionaires and red tape for America's families. Cut the programs fundamental to families thriving and deliver massive tax gifts to the richest Americans. You know, 77% of the enrollees in the exchange, the ACA exchange, Affordable Care Act exchange, they're in states Trump won. So when a Democrat stands up on this floor and says we need to fix these tax credits so people can afford insurance, the vast majority of people they're trying to help live in red states, because we're not advocating based on something that's partisan. We're advocating on what's good for America. And we're simply saying, quit shutting down the government, fix this egregious condition, and America will be better off. And I will say almost everyone believes politically Republicans would be better off as well if they fix this egregious attack on health care. The red carpet for the rich, red tape for families, is a terrible philosophy to go forward in America. One piece of the authoritarian puzzle. You have the rubber stamp Congress. You have the Supreme Court that delivers more power to the executive. You have the aggressive authoritarian personality as president. You have government by and for the powerful, not government by and for the people. If, therefore, you have government by and for the powerful, you pass bills like the big, ugly betrayal bill that slashes health care to deliver tax breaks for billionaires. That's how these two pieces are connected. The authoritarian takeover by the president and the horrific attack on ordinary people to fund tax breaks for the powerful, that's how these two things are connected. It's government by and for the powerful rather than by and for the people. But in the world, according to our Constitution, the president is not a king. The laws are not suggestions. And the Constitution is not optional. And that's why I will keep raising the alarm bells here on the floor of the Senate, because our country's in deep trouble. It's in the middle of a massive authoritarian corruption of our Constitution. And that's why 7 million people took to the streets on Saturday. This brings us to the first chapter of how democracies die. And the reason I've come to the floor to read it tonight and to do commentary, and as well as the book on tyranny, is to amplify the alarm bells. The citizens, 7 million strong, took to the streets in the largest demonstration in American history. But 7 million is only a small fraction of the population of this country. So just as they rang the alarm bells and hoped that their neighbors would pay attention, their newspapers would pay attention, that we, their electeds, would pay attention, it's important that those of us here in this Senate chamber also ring the alarm bells. And I've chosen these two books because there is no volume I know that better describes how democracies have died through an authoritarian takeover, not through a military coup, but through the obliteration of the checks and balances of the Constitution. So, Fateful Alliances is the name of this chapter. Again, I'm reading from this book, which I'll leave this up to remind folks. A quarrel has arisen between the horse and the stag. So the horse came to a hunter to ask his help to take revenge on the stag. And the hunter agreed, but said, "If you desire to conquer the stag, you must permit me to place this piece of iron between your jaws so that I may guide you with these reins, and allow this saddle to be placed upon your back so I may keep steady upon you as we follow the enemy." The horse agreed. And the hunter soon saddled and bridled him. And then with the aid of the hunter, the horse soon overcame the stag and said to the hunter, "Now get off and remove those things from my mouth and back." "Not so fast, my friend," said the hunter. "I have now got you under bit and spur and prefer to keep you as you are at present." It's a passage from Aesop's Fables. On October 30th, 1922, Benito Mussolini arrived in Rome at 10:55 in an overnight sleeping cart for Milan. He had been invited to the capital city by the king to accept Italy's premiership and form a new cabinet. Accompanied by a small group of guards, Mussolini first stopped at the hotel and then, wearing a black suit jacket, black shirt, matching black bowler hat, walked triumphantly to the king's Quirinal Palace. Rome was filled with rumors of unrest. Bands of fascists, many in mismatched uniforms, roamed the streets. Mussolini, aware of the power of the spectacle, strode into the king's marble-floored residential palace and greeted him. "Sire, forgive my attire. I come from the battlefield." This was the beginning of Mussolini's legendary March on Rome. The image of masses of black shirts crossing the Rubicon to seize power from Italy's liberal state became fascist canon, repeated on national holidays in children's school books throughout the 1920s and 1930s. Mussolini did his part to enshrine the myth. At the last train stop, before entering Rome that day, he had considered disembarking to ride into the city on horseback, surrounded by guards. Though the plan was abandoned, afterward, he did all he could to bolster the legend of his rise to power as, in his own words, a revolution, an insurrectional act, and launched a new fascist epoch. The truth was more mundane. The bulk of Mussolini's black shirts, often poorly fed and unarmed, arrived only after he had been invited to become prime minister. Arrived only after he'd been invited to become prime minister. The squads of fascists around the country were menaced, but Mussolini's machinations to take the reins of state were no revolution. He used his party's 35 parliamentary votes, divisions among establishment politicians, fear of socialism, and the threat of violence to capture the attention of the timid King Victor Emmanuel III, who saw in Mussolini a rising political star and a means of neutralizing unrest. With political order restored by Mussolini's appointment and socialism in retreat, the Italian stock market soared Elder statesmen of the liberal establishment, such as Giovanni Giolitti, Antonio Salandra, found themselves applauding the turn of events. They regarded Mussolini as a useful ally, but not unlike the horse in Aesop's fable, Italy soon found itself under bit and spur. Some version of this story has repeated itself throughout the world over the last century. A cast of political outsiders, including Adolf Hitler, Vargas in Brazil, Fujimori in Peru, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, came to power on the same path from the inside, via elections or alliances with powerful political figures. In each instance, elites believed the invitation to power would contain the outsider, lead to a restoration of control by mainstream politicians. But their plans backfired. A lethal mix of ambition, fear, and miscalculation conspired to lead them to the same fateful mistake, willingly handing over the keys of power to an autocrat in the making. Why do seasoned elder statesmen make this mistake? There are few more gripping illustrations in the rise of Adolf Hitler in January 1933. His capacity for violent insurrection was on display as early as Munich's beer hall push of 1923, a surprise evening strike in which his group of pistol-bearing loyalists took control of several government buildings and a Munich beer hall where Bavarian officials were meeting. The ill-conceived attack was halted by the authorities, and Hitler spent 9 months in jail, where he wrote his infamous personal testament, Mein Kampf. Thereafter, Hitler publicly committed to gaining power via elections. Initially, his National Socialist movement found few votes. The Weimar political system had been founded in 1919 by a pro-democratic coalition of Catholics, liberals, social democrats. But by 1930, with the German economy reeling, the center-right fell prey to infighting. The communists and the Nazis grew in popularity. The elected government collapsed in March 1930 amid the pain of the Great Depression. With political gridlock blocking government action, the figurehead president, World War I hero Paul von Hindenburg, took advantage of a constitutional article giving the head of state the authority to name chancellors in the exceptional circumstance that Parliament failed to deliver governing majorities. The aim of those unelected chancellors and the president was not only to govern, but to sideline the radicals on the left and right. First, Center Party economist Heinrich Brüning, who would later flee Germany to become a professor in the United States, attempted but failed to restore economic growth. His time as chancellor was short-lived. President von Hindenburg turned next to nobleman Franz von Papen, and then in growing dependency to von Papen's close friend and rival, former defense minister General Kurt von Schleicher. But without parliamentary majorities in the Reichstag, stalemate persisted. Leaders, for good reason, feared the next election. Convinced that something must give, a cabal of rivalrous conservatives convened in late January 1933 and settled on a solution. A popular outsider should be placed at the head of the government. They despised him, but knew that at least he had a mass following. And most of all, they thought he could control him. On January 30th, 1933, von Papen, one of the chief architects of the plan, dismissed worries over the gamble that would make Adolf Hitler chancellor of a crisis-ridden Germany with the reassuring words, "We've engaged him for ourselves. Within 2 months, we will have pushed him so far into a corner he will squeal." A more profound miscalculation is hard to imagine. The Italian and German experiences highlight the type of fateful alliance that often elevates authoritarians to power. In any democracy, politicians will at times face severe challenges. An economic crisis, public discontent, electoral decline of mainstream political parties, all test the judgment even of the most experienced insiders. If a charismatic outsider emerges on the scene, gaining popularity as he challenges the old order, it's tempting for establishment politicians who feel their control's unraveling to try to co-opt him. If an insider breaks ranks to embrace the insurgent before his rivals do, he can use the outsider's energy and base to outmaneuver his peers, and then establishment politicians hope the insurgents can be redirected to support their own program. This sort of devil's bargain often mutates the benefit of the insurgent, as alliances provide outsiders with enough respectability to become legitimate contenders for power. In the early 20s, Italy, the old liberal order was crumbling and growing strikes and social unrest. The failure of traditional parties to forge solid parliamentary majorities left the elderly fifth-term Prime Minister Giovanni Giolitti desperate, and against the wish of advisors, he called early elections in 1921. With the aim of tapping into the fascist mass appeal, Giolitti decided to offer Mussolini's upstart movement a place on his electoral group's bourgeois bloc of nationalists, fascists, and liberals. The bourgeois bloc won less than 20% of the vote, leading to Giolitti's resignation, but Mussolini's place on the ticket gave his ragtag group the legitimacy it would need to enable its rise. Such fateful alliances are hardly confined to interwar Europe. They help explain the rise of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. Venezuela had prided itself on being South America's oldest democracy. In place since 1958, Chavez, a junior military officer and failed coup leader who had never held public office, was a political outsider. But his rise to power was given a critical boost from a consummate insider, ex-President Rafael Caldera, one of the founders of Venezuelan democracy. Venezuelan politics was long dominated by two parties, the center-left Democratic Action and Caldera's center-right Social Christian Party, known as COPEI. The two alternated in power peacefully for more than 30 years. And by the 70s, Venezuela was viewed as a model democracy in a region plagued by coups and dictatorships. During the 80s, the country's oil dependent economy sank into a prolonged slump, however, and a crisis persisted for a decade. Nearly doubled the poverty rate. Not surprisingly, Venezuelans grew disaffected. Massive riots in 1989 suggested the established parties were in trouble. And 3 years later, a group of junior military officers rose up against President Andrés Perez, led by Hugo Chavez. The rebels called themselves Bolivarians, often after revered independence hero Simón Bolívar. The coup failed, but when the now detained Chavez appeared on live television to tell his supporters to lay down their arms, declaring in words that would become legendary that their mission had failed for now, he became a hero in the eyes of many Venezuelans, particularly poor ones. Following a second coup, the imprisoned Chavez changed course, opting to pursue power via elections. He would need help. In these stories, what these two authors are laying out in various countries is how individuals with authoritarian tendencies rose and then eventually took power, actually using the path of electoral politics. And that is a recognition we should all have, that democracies don't simply die because men in guns storm the home of the president and set it on fire. They die because the electoral process itself gives rise to individuals who manipulate it. And soon the checks and balances that were so treasured and thought so strong disappear. And that by looking to these other countries, you can see and understand better what is happening in our own country. Although ex-President Caldera was a well-regarded elder statesman, his career was waning in 1992. 4 years earlier, he had failed to secure his party's presidential nomination, and he was now considered a political relic. But the 76-year-old senator still dreamed of returning to the presidency, and Chavez's emergence provided him with a lifeline. On the night of Chavez's initial coup, the former president stood up during an emergency joint session of Congress and embraced the rebels' cause, declaring, "It's difficult to ask the people to sacrifice themselves for freedom and democracy when they think that freedom and democracy are incapable of giving them food to eat, of preventing the astronomical rise in the cost of subsistence, or placing a definitive end to the terrible scourge of corruption that in the eyes of the entire world is eating away at the institutions of Venezuela with each passing day." The stunning speech resurrected Caldera's political career. Having tapped into Chavez's anti-system constituency, the ex-president's public support swelled, which allowed him to make a successful presidential bid in 1993. Caldera's flirtation with Chavez did more than boost his own standing. It gave Chavez credibility. Chavez and his comrades had long sought to destroy their country's 34-year-old democracy, but rather than denouncing the coup leaders as extremists, an extremist threat, the former president offered them public sympathy and with it an opening to mainstream politics. Caldera helped open the gates of the presidential palace for Chavez by dealing a mortal blow to Venezuela's established parties. In a stunning about-face, he abandoned his own party, the party he had founded a half-century early, and launched an independent presidential bid. To be sure, the parties were already in crisis, but Caldera's departure and anti-establishment campaign helped bury them. The party system collapsed after Caldera's 1993 election as an anti-party independent, paving the way for future outsiders. 5 years later, it would be Chavez's turn. But back in 1993, Chavez still had a major problem. He was in jail, awaiting trial for treason. However, in 1994, now President Caldera dropped all the charges. Caldera's final act in enabling Chavez was literally opening the gates of the prison. Immediately after Chavez's release, a reporter asked him where he was going. "To power," he replied. Freeing Chavez was popular, and Caldera had promised such a move during his campaign. Like most Venezuelan elites, he viewed Chavez as a passing fad, someone who would likely fall out of public favor by the next election. But in dropping the charges, rather than allowing Chavez to stand trial, Caldera elevated him, transforming the coup leader overnight into a viable presidential candidate. And then in December 1998, Chavez won the presidency, and he won it easily, defeating an establishment-backed candidate. On Inauguration Day, Caldera, the outgoing president, could not bring himself to deliver the oath of office as tradition dictated. Instead, he stood glumly off to one side. Despite their vast differences, Hitler, Mussolini, and Chavez followed routes to power that share striking similarities. Not only were they outsiders with a flair for capturing public attention, but each of them rose to power because establishment politicians overlooked the warning signs and either handed power over to them or opened the door for them. The abdication of political responsibility by existing leaders often marks the nation's first step toward authoritarianism. Years after Chavez's presidential victory, Rafael Caldera explained his mistakes simply. Quote, "Nobody thought Chavez had even the remotest chance of becoming president." End of quote. And merely a day after Hitler became chancellor, a prominent conservative who aided him admitted, quote, "I have just committed the greatest stupidity of my life. I have allied myself with the greatest demagogue in world history." End of quote. Not all democracies have fallen into this trap. Some, including Belgium, Britain, Costa Rica, and Finland, have faced challenges from demagogues, but also managed to keep them out of power. How have they done it? It's tempting to think the survival is rooted in the collective wisdom of the voters. Maybe Belgians and Costa Ricans were simply more democratic than their counterparts in Germany or Italy. After all, we like to believe that the fate of government lies in the hands of its citizens. If people hold democratic values, democracy will be safe. If citizens are open to authoritarian appeals, then sooner or later, democracy will be in trouble. But this view is wrong. It assumes too much of democracy, that the people can shape it at will, the kind of government they possess. It's hard to find any evidence of majority support for authoritarianism in 1920s Germany or 1920s Italy. Before the Nazis and fascists seized power, less than 2% of the population were party members, and neither party achieved anything close to majority of the vote in free and fair elections. Rather, solid electoral majorities opposed Hitler, opposed Mussolini, before both men achieved power with the support of political insiders blind to the danger of their own ambitions. Hugo Chavez was elected by a majority of voters, but there is little evidence that Venezuelans were looking for a strongman. At the time, public support for democracy was higher than in Chile, a country that was and remains stably democratic. According to the 1998 Latino Barometro survey, 60% of Venezuelans agreed with the statement, democracy is always the best form of government. Only 25% agreed that under some circumstances an authoritarian government can be preferable. By contrast, only 53% of respondents in Chile agreed that democracy is always the best form. Potential demagogues exist in all democracies, and occasionally one or more of them may strike a public chord. But in some democracies, political leaders heed the warning and take the steps to make the authoritarians not form in the government. They remain on the fringes, far from the centers of power. When faced with the rise of extremists or demagogues, they make a concerted effort to isolate them, to defeat them. Although mass responses to extremist appeals matter, what matters more is whether political elites, especially parties, serve as filters. Put simply, political parties are democracy's gatekeepers. If authoritarians are to be kept out, they must first have to be identified. There is, alas, no foolproof advance warning system. Many authoritarians can easily be recognized before they come to power. They have a clear track record. Hitler led a failed putsch. Chavez led a failed military uprising. Mussolini's engaged in paramilitary violence. Argentina in the mid-20th century, Juan Perón helped lead a successful coup 2.5 years before running for president. But politicians do not always reveal the full scale of their authoritarianism before reaching power. Some adhere to democratic norms early in their careers, only to abandon them later. Consider Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban. Orban and his Fidesz party began as liberal Democrats. And in the first stint as Prime Minister, between 1998 and 2002, Orban governed democratically. His autocratic about-face after returning to power was a genuine surprise in 2010. So how do we identify authoritarianism in politicians who don't have an obvious anti-democratic record? Here we turn to the eminent political scientist Juan Linz. Born in Weimar, Germany, raised amid Spain's civil war, Linz knew all too well the perils of losing a democracy. As a professor at Yale, he devoted much of his career to trying to understand how and why democracies die. Many of Linz's conclusions can be found in a small book called The Breakdown of Democratic Regimes. It was published in 1978. The book highlights the role of politicians, showing how their behavior can either reinforce democracy or put it at risk. He proposed a litmus test for identifying anti-democratic politicians. Building on his work, we have developed a set of 4 behavioral warning signs that help us know an authoritarian when we see one. We should worry when a politician, 1, rejects in words or action the democratic rules of the game. 2, denies the legitimacy of opponents. 3, tolerates or encourages violence. Or 4, indicates a willingness to curtail the civil liberties of opponents, including the media. They've been put a table in the book to assess politicians in terms of these 4 factors. A politician who meets even one of these 4 factors is cause for concern. What kinds of candidates tend to test positive on a litmus test for authoritarianism? Very often populist outsiders. Populists are anti-establishment. Figures who, claiming to represent the voice of the people, wage war on what they depict as a corrupt and conspiratorial elite. They deny the legitimacy of established parties, attacking them as undemocratic or even unpatriotic. To tell voters the existing system is not really a democracy, but has been hijacked, corrupted, or rigged. They promise to bury the elite and return power to the people. This discourse should be taken seriously. When populists win, they often assault democratic institutions. In Latin America, for example, all 15 presidents elected in Bolivia, Ecuador, Peru, and Venezuela between 1990 and 2012, of those 15, 5 were populist outsiders: Fujimori, Chavez, Evo Morales, Lucio Gutierrez, and Rafael Correa. All 5 ended up weakening the democratic institutions. So those 4 factors really are something for us to pay significant attention to. Does an individual reject democratic rules of the game? Do they express a willingness to violate the Constitution? Do they suggest a need for anti-democratic measures such as canceling elections, or banning certain organizations, or restricting civil rights? Do they seek to use extra-constitutional means to change the government? Do they attempt to undermine the legitimacy of elections, for example, by refusing to accept credible election results? I think it goes without needing to point it out that our president rejected credible electoral results. And I was sitting in this chamber when the mob he directed to attack and disrupt the counting of the electoral ballots filled these hallways, when multiple police officers were attacked and injured. It was stunning to sit here in our democracy and see our Capitol Police running to lock these doors to protect us. Stunning to have them first tell us, quickly leave the chamber, and then quickly say, don't leave the chamber, while they organized an escape route. I remember that sitting down here in front were the boxes, these beautiful wooden boxes containing the electoral ballots from all across the nation. These boxes, which were the absolute symbol of democratic governance, the heart, the pulsating heart of our democracy. Eventually, the officers said, "Ready? We want you to leave. Leave quickly by this door that's in front of me and to the left." And as they guided us out, one of the members of the parliamentarian team said, "We need to grab the ballot boxes." And thank goodness they did, because I have no doubt that mob would have burned or destroyed those boxes of ballots that contained the decision of our states across this country. The folks who rampaged through the hallways here were calling for the death of the vice president. They certainly were determined block the counting of ballots to interrupt the peaceful transfer of power. What is extraordinary is that since our election of George Washington, each president in turn has facilitated the smooth transition to the next president. May not have been somebody they agreed with. It may not be somebody they liked. It may have been somebody from the far side of the political spectrum. And yet they facilitated that peaceful transfer until Donald Trump sent a mob to Capitol Hill to stop the counting of the ballots. So when the authors of this book lay out how various folks have undermined democracy in elected office, but had previously and been engaged in some sort of action to try to disrupt the function of the democracy, there is a parallel here that should not be ignored. The second warning feature is denying the legitimacy of political opponents. Do they describe their rivals as subversive or opposed to the constitutional order? Do they claim that their rivals constitute a threat to national security? Do they baselessly describe their partisan rivals as criminals whose supposed violation of the laws disqualifies them from participation in the political arena? Do they baselessly suggest their rivals are foreign agents and that they are secretly working in alliance with a foreign government? We have, right now, a president who has an enemies list. Well, Nixon had an enemies list, but he didn't operationalize the powers of the executive branch to go after them the way President Trump is doing right now. The third warning sign is related to toleration or encouragement of violence. Do they have ties to militias or guerrillas or organizations that engage in illicit violence? Have they or their partisan allies sponsored or encouraged mob attacks? Have they tacitly endorsed violence by their supporters by refusing to unambiguously condemn it and punish it? Have they praised other significant acts of political violence, either in the past or elsewhere in the world? Well, certainly, we see in President Trump that he did encourage a gang to come, or a mob to attack Capitol Hill. There was no condemnation of it. And as for punishing it, he issued pardons of the people who attacked Capitol Hill to stop the peaceful transfer of power. The fourth is readiness to curtail civil liberties, including the liberties of opponents and the media. Have they supported laws or policies that restrict civil liberties, such as expanded libel, defamation laws, laws restricting protest or criticism of the government or certain civic or political organs? Have they threatened to take legal or other punitive action against critics in rival parties, civil societies, or the media? Have they praised repressive measures taken by other governments, either in past or elsewhere in the world? Certainly, there again, we hear the resonance of President Trump, a man who has constantly praised dictators around the world, seen them as the individuals that he respects and admires. And we've certainly seen him taking legal action against those he disagrees with, against our networks, against our universities, against our law firms. So these are four tests that in 2018, these scholars laid out. These are the early warning signs of authoritarian power. And we see that each and every one of them reverberates at this moment. So that's why tonight I have come to ring the alarm bells. to ring the alarm bells that our democracy is in deep trouble. We have an authoritarian president. We have a rubber-stamped Congress. We have a Supreme Court handing the executive more power. The three major elements that wipe out the separation of powers and the checks and balances of the Constitution. We have in President Trump an individual that has conducted himself in the manner that rings each one of the alarm bells that these scholars indicate are signs of an authoritarian personality. Their book goes on. Keeping authoritarian politicians out of power is more easily said than done. Democracies don't ban parties or prohibit candidates from standing for election, and we do not advocate such measures. The responsibility for filtering out authoritarians lies with the political parties and the party leaders, the democracy's gatekeepers. Successful gatekeeping requires that mainstream parties isolate and defeat extremist forces, a behavior political scientist Nancy Bermeo calls distancing. Pro-democratic parties may engage in distancing in several ways. They can keep would-be authoritarians off the party ballots at election time, requiring that they resist the temptation to nominate these extremists for higher office even when they can potentially deliver votes. Second, parties can root out extremists in the grassroots of their own ranks. Third, pro-democratic parties can avoid all alliances with anti-democratic parties. Fourth, pro-democratic parties can act to systematically isolate rather than legitimize extremists. Finally, whenever extremists emerge as serious electoral contenders, mainstream parties must forge a united front to defeat them. To quote Linz, they must be willing to join with opponents ideologically distant but committed to the survival of the democratic political order. In normal circumstances, this is almost unimaginable. Each party's followers would be infuriated at the seeming betrayal of principles. But in extraordinary times, courageous party leadership means putting democracy and country before party and articulating to voters what is at stake. When a party or politician that tests positive on our litmus test emerges, there is little alternative. United democratic fronts can prevent extremists from winning power, which can mean saving a democracy. So the book goes on to lay out a number of cases around the world in which parties teamed up with each other when they saw the threat of an extremist who exhibited authoritarian tendencies. They worked together to save their democratic republic. That has not happened here, and that should concern us all, because when that fails, the parties don't come together to stop an authoritarian extremist. That authoritarian starts to expand the power around the presidency, starts to attack the liberties of the country, the freedom of the press, the freedom of the assembly, starts to militarize and weaponize the Department of Justice against enemies, plots to justify sending the military out during peacetime to attack peaceful protesters. This is what happens when one fails to proceed to work together to stop a political extremist, and that extremist ends up in power. The mastermind behind Trump's 100 days of chaos and lawbreaking is Russ Vought. He is director of the Office of Management and the Budget. He directed that office at the end of Trump's first term. In the intervening 4 years, he was the architect of Project 2025, and now he leads OMB again. I interviewed him in my office before his nomination hearing, and he was very clear with me about his viewpoint, in which he says the president has complete power over every element of the executive branch. Unitary executive theory. The president, he believes, can ignore all the laws passed by Congress and perhaps orders of the court that constrain how the president manages the executive branch. Vogt anticipates that when Trump's lawbreaking reaches the Supreme Court, a deferential court will legitimize the unitary executive theory and hand Trump more power. And so far, this year, he has been right. I called Mr. Vogt as the chief engineer of Trump's authoritarian campaign the most dangerous man in America. I led a 30-hour Senate debate on his nomination to put a spotlight on him and his dangerous ideas. But he was confirmed to the position of OMP, where he's become the conductor of the Trumpian authoritarian train, lining up policy after policy after policy to be signed by the president in executive order after executive order after executive order. He has proven extremely effective in this undertaking. Several hundred executive orders prepared and signed. Multiple attacks on our fundamental freedoms carefully coordinated. Attack on the freedom of the press. Trying to tell networks what errors they can have, even what comedians can perform. Attacks certainly on our newspapers, on our universities, on our law firms. Nowhere has his efforts been more effective, however, than in stealing congressional power of the purse. Article 1 of our beloved We the People Constitution says Congress will decide what programs will be funded and how much. Now, that law has to be signed by the president, but once signed, it is the law. Drafted by Congress, passed by the House, passed by the Senate, signed by the president, it is the law. But Mr. Vogt thinks not. He felt that these laws regarding what programs should be funded are simply suggestions. Every time you hear the president say, or a member of his cabinet say, or Mr. Vogt say, we shut down a program because it's not in line with the president's priorities, what you're hearing is the articulation of the president making the decisions about what programs are funded and at what level. A direct violation of the Constitution. The power of the purse. This strategy is illegal. It is unconstitutional. And the Supreme Court has said so twice. In 1975, the Supreme Court ruled that the Nixon administration could not ignore Congress's power of the purse through impoundments. Now, the ruling was in 1975. Nixon was already out of power because of Watergate, but it stemmed from the Nixon administration's actions to say, oh, Congress approved these funds for programs I don't like, so I'm just not going to forward the funds to the departments and kill the programs. And the Supreme Court robustly said, hell no. You can't do that. That's unconstitutional. That violates the separation of powers. That violates our Constitution. In 1998, the Supreme Court ruled that Congress could not give away or delegate its power of the purse to the president through a line item veto. This is a very popular idea at the time. when the Gingrich election occurred, and I say Gingrich election, he really put forward a whole new strategy for the Republican members of the House. He said, for too long, we have simply worked to make laws better and include more of our elements. But that simply results in laws passing and the majority, Democrats, taking credit for them. We would do far better to oppose them in every way we can and then argue to the American people, they have failed to govern well, so elect us. In addition, he laid out a series of reforms, contract with America, and in so doing, he really touched a strong vein of enthusiasm across the land. And so the House, for the first time in, I think, 4 decades, became a Republican majority, and certainly it was a Republican majority here in the Senate. And so in that time period between January 95 and January 97, stemming from the November 94 election, this were a number of strategies that they wanted to implement, some of them straight off of their contract with America. And one of those was to do a constitutional amendment that would create a balanced budget. And they needed no extra votes in the House. They passed it easily. They had the supermajority, the 2/3 supermajority needed. And the constitutional amendment has to pass both chambers, and then it has to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. And then it ran into trouble over here in the Senate. They had 66 votes, but not 67 votes, and they needed 67. And the one Republican who held out was Senator Mark Hatfield. And Senator Mark Hatfield said, you know, here's the story. Every single year, we decide what the deficit is by the combination of the laws we pass for revenue and the laws we pass for programs, to fund programs. And Hatfield was chair of the Appropriations Committee, the Spending Committee. And so with this in mind, that every year Congress decided how much deficit or debt there would be, well, Hatfield said that's the right answer, because sometimes we need to spend more because we have a national security challenge, a war. And sometimes we need to spend more because we're in a recession. And other times we need to save more, but we decide this on a year-by-year basis. Anyway, that was one of the themes of the Gingrich Revolution. And it did not make it through the Senate because it was one vote short, and so it never went out to the voters in the collected states. But a second idea on this agenda was a way we can control the budget is to let the president decide. We will simply take the Constitution, which says it falls on us, all of us, to proceed to decide, and we will simply delegate that to the president. Well, that's like creating a strongman state. Now you have the president not just executing the laws, but deciding what programs will be funded and what level. And the Supreme Court said, hell no. We have a Constitution. We have a democracy. And we do not vest both the creation of the laws and the execution of the laws in the same branch of government. Congress must decide and write the laws on how much is to go to what programs. And they cannot give away that power to the president. You would be creating an authoritarian state. You cannot do that. You took an oath to the office and an oath to the Constitution. The Constitution lays out a separation of powers, and you cannot delegate that away. That's why I called Vogt the most dangerous man in America, because he was in my office saying that's exactly what he intended to do, was to take that power away from Congress and hand it to the president. And I must say, I complimented him on his honesty that that was his intention. He wasn't disguising it one bit. It was his life philosophy, or his philosophy of his life about our government. It was what he had written into written into the architecture of Project 2025, a vastly stronger authoritarian presidency. And he was telling me in my office before his hearing on the Budget Committee that that was exactly what he intended to execute and that he would be backed up by the Supreme Court. So Trump, once in office, did impound funds. He did shut down programs that were funded by law without authority to do so. Some of them were ones that electric charging stations across America, programs for sanctuary cities, immigration lawyers who represent unaccompanied children. But the most notorious impoundment was the weekend attack on the U.S. Agency for International Development. On February 3rd, Elon Musk posted on X that he and Doge had spent the weekend feeding USAID into the wood chipper. That's a pretty stunning moment. A program authorized by law, funded by Congress, in a law signed by a president, shut down over a weekend. No consultation with Congress, no hearings, no consultation with the countries where these programs operated, no consultation with other governments that provide help to see if they would step in. No, just shut it down over a weekend. Our Secretary of State was in a hearing before the Senate, and I asked him how much Elon Musk, who had bragged about feeding the program into the wood chipper, how much he had consulted the Secretary of State. And I expected what he was going to say was there wasn't much consultation. Elon Musk was head of Doge. Elon Musk acted. The president had confidence in him. And in a weekend, the programs were shut down. But instead he said, no. I, the Secretary of State, was very involved. That he, in a hotel room over a weekend, I believe he said he was in Guatemala, proceeded to cancel hundreds of contracts. So apparently there was pretty close coordination between Elon Musk and Doge and the Secretary of State in feeding these programs into the wood chipper, programs authorized and funded under the law. How does that differ from a line item veto? The president says, I don't like this program, shut it down. Or delegates that power to Elon Musk and the Secretary of State. I don't like this program, shut it down. How does that possibly fit with the Supreme Court decisions that say the power of the purse rests with Congress, and when it's in law, a president cannot impound the funds? They have to execute the law the way it's written. But impound they did, and in this case, it was horrifically destructive. Innocent people around the world died because those programs were shut down overnight. These programs were programs for tuberculosis, for malaria, for HIV/AIDS. Those are the three worst pandemics in the world, do the most destruction. And they were programs for nutrition. And without nutrition, people are in trouble. So there is a tracker that has been set up by experts in international economic development to try to understand how many programs were shut down and how they affected the folks who benefited from those programs. And their estimate as of June 26th, so this is going back several months, was that shutting down that program in the wood chipper overnight, 30,000 children died of malaria. 72,000 children died of diarrhea. Diarrhea is often the consequence in poor countries of not having access to clean water. 88,000 children died from malnutrition. 94,000 children died from pneumonia. One study published on July 19th in The Lancet, a prestigious peer-reviewed medical journal, estimates that as a result of USAID being fed into the wood chipper, 14 million people could die by 2030, including 4.5 million children under the age of 5. I was also struck in reading this analysis that it noted that it isn't just children who die, it's adults. And when the adults die, they're orphans, and it had a massive estimate of the number of orphans had been created by this weekend shutdown of feeding USAID into the wood chipper. Maybe these analyses are overstated. Maybe local folks found ways to sub in for the sudden shutdown more effectively than the academics who study this believe. Maybe. Maybe other nations geared up faster to replace the shutdown than was anticipated. But even if you take these results put together by experts of international programs and cut them in half, massive number of people were killed across the country because a Secretary of State and a appointed head of DOGE, Elon Musk, decided to shut this program down, contrary to law. That's not supposed to happen in a democracy. In a democracy, the president would say, I don't love how much money we're spending on international programs for public health, for malaria, tuberculosis, for HIV/AIDS, for nutrition, for maternity care. And so here's my budget, and I want the majorities in both chambers to proceed to eliminate some of those programs and decrease them. And then you'd have thoughtful hearings here on how to go about that effort, and to do so in a manner that was responsible. And some folks would have come and testified and said, here are the consequences of shutting down program X, Y, and Z. Do you really want to do that? Or do you want to work out a plan to transfer those responsibilities to some of our European partners who might pick up those responsibilities? Or to empower some of the local governments where those programs operate to be able to pick up some of those programs. But don't shut them down. We wouldn't shut them down overnight because, one, that would break the law, and two, a massive number of people die. But they did shut them down overnight, and a massive number of people have died. One of the things that Trump and Vote shut down was the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which mission, of course, is to safeguard Americans from all kinds of financial scams. Nobody likes to be scammed. Nobody likes to be ripped off. And since it was created back in 2011, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, or CFPB for short, has returned $21 billion in checks back to American citizens. $21 billion. I mean, that's a significant sum. Even in a world where maybe millions don't seem as large as they used to, billions still seem pretty substantial. I mean, $21 billion? You know, Trump has just said he wants to send a massive $20 billion to $40 billion check to Argentina of our taxpayer money to help rescue a right-wing government, bail them out. I mean, $20 billion, it's a lot, got returned. And here's the thing, because those scams were shut down, that $20 billion probably only represents a small fraction of the money saved by American consumers, a small fraction. So hallelujah, we have an anti-scam agency helping Americans not get ripped off by clever or illegal tactics. And they've even recovered money from those companies that exercise those and sent checks, $21 billion worth of checks to the American consumer. You know, Elizabeth Warren was not in the Senate when this was passed, but it was her idea. And she came here to Capitol Hill, and she went from office to office saying, hey, we have a consumer protection group for appliances. We don't want toasters burning down the house, but shouldn't we have a way to stop scams that burn down people's finances? And I said to her, I'm on the banking committee. I was put on the banking committee to lead the charge to shut down predatory mortgages. And I think it's a great idea you're suggesting, and I'll do everything I can to help get it passed. And I did, and so did others. So that was a citizen, non-elected, coming here and saying, here's a great idea. Let's get an anti-scam agency. Who likes to be scammed? Almost everybody I know can tell a story of a family member being scammed or almost scammed. I was very struck by a story my mother told me. She's no longer with us. And she was very embarrassed about this story, as many people are when they have been scammed or almost scammed. She got a phone call. And on the phone was a person representing themselves as a border agent at the border between Canada and the United States. And the border agent said, your grandson has been arrested at the border for trying to bring cannabis into the United States. And that is a huge crime. And we caught him red-handed. And we have two options, which is why we're giving you a call. And one option is he can pay a fine and be released today if someone wires the fine money to us. And the second option is he can go to prison here, get a court hearing several months down the road, and then possibly go to prison with a conviction. And so, of course, my mother inquired, well, what is the amount of money required? And the answer was $5,000 to pay the penalty for this attempted smuggling. And then they put the grandson on the phone, except it was not the grandson, but it was someone pretending to be the grandson. And because of the internet, you can learn some factors about how old people are and that sort of thing and where they've gone to school. And so he's sobbing on the phone, grandmother, do not tell my parents. Please do not tell my parents. I can't believe I did this terrible, stupid thing. And if you can help me out, it just would mean so much. And my mother, wanting to help her grandson, said yes. And she went down to the bank and she sent a $5,000 wire to the place it was supposed to be sent to, and she came home and she started to feel like, is this really right? Was my grandson actually in Canada? And as she started to feel that, she started to have this dreaded feeling of, I've been scammed. And she called up my brother-in-law and said, so why did the grandson decide to go traveling in Canada? He said, well, he's not in Canada, he's right here. He's right here. And so my mother went back down to the bank, actually was able to cancel the wire just in the nick of time, I suppose. They were not on their toes wherever the money went to. They didn't grab it in time. Maybe it was nighttime at the bank, wherever in the world the money went to. And so she did not lose her $5,000, a significant sum for any ordinary American. Almost everyone has a story of someone in their family who has nearly succumbed to a scam. I'll tell you about one I almost succumbed to. I got a message, I believe it was a text message, maybe it was an email, and it said, "We have detected illegal downloads of songs off this website and done by a person in your family." And I'm like, oh my goodness, are you kidding me? And the message said, if you pay for the song, no charges will be filed. $25 fee. And I thought, oh, I can't reach my children right now. I can't really believe one of them would do this, but I know it's not uncommon for kids to download songs off the internet. Maybe this happened. I certainly don't want charges to be filed. And it said, you know, go to a website and you fill in and you pay your $25 and it's all over. And I went to the website, and when I saw fill in your credit card, the light went off in my head. And I went, oh, this is a scam. They want my credit card number. They don't want the $25. They want my credit card number. Think of all the things, all the expenses they can run up on my credit card once they have my credit card number. They'll have the expiration date. They'll have the 3-digit code from the back of it. And I go, oh my goodness, I can't believe I almost fell for that scam. And I suspect most members of the Senate have someone in their family who has almost fell for a scam. And here, so we set up this agency to stop illegal practices, unethical practices that rip people off. It's returned $21 billion, and it's probably saved Americans because it shut down these practices, these scam practices, probably saved them hundreds of billions of dollars. That's a significant deal. That is as important as having a toaster that doesn't burn down your house. Well, maybe not quite if it burns down your house, but it's just as important as consumer appliance protection is financial protection. So what happened with CBO? And I'm going to just note that essentially the Trump administration shut it down. That's what happened to it. There's an article in Bloomberg about how this agenda has been shaped not by President Trump, not by Elon Musk, but by the architect or an architect of Project 2025. Let's see what this article has to say. Kat Farman realized in January that her job might be at serious risk. It was the night she learned that a small group of engineers close to Elon Musk had forced their way into the headquarters of the U.S. Agency for International Development. In the days that followed, they'd gained access to sensitive employee records and bar staff from the building. The legality of all this was questionable. USAID exists because of an act of Congress. I mean, it can only be dissolved in the same way, but that didn't deter Musk from declaring victory. Quote, "We spent the weekend feeding USAID into the wood chipper," he posted on X on February 3rd. Farman works for a different government agency, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, CFPB. But she understood that the USAID news suggested that CFPB might be next. The CFPB, like USAID, is somewhat obscure, with a do-gooder mission that conservatives, including Musk, have derided as wasteful and excessively woke. Quote, "I could see we were vulnerable in the same way USAID was," said Farman, who is president of the CFPB union. it became clear to Farman that her adversary wasn't Musk or any engineers who might have doused themselves with Axe's unique eau de middle school. She was really up against Russell Vogt, the Trump loyalist who had just been named director of the Office of Management and Budget, as well as acting director of the CFPB. Farman hadn't heard of Vogt before he became the CFPB director, which is pretty much how Vogt likes it. A self-described, quote, boring budget guy, best known for co-authoring the 900-page policy playbook of the Heritage Foundation Project 2025, which has become something of a Bible for Trump's second term. Vogt's think tank, the Center for Renewing America, has produced numerous policy papers that advocate for such Trump fixations as the annexation of Greenland. A prudent aim, according to a CRA paper, CRA, Center for Reviewing America, and enacting broad tariffs. Quote, just as sometimes a nation must go to war with guns and bombs, so sometimes trade wars are necessary, unquote, among others. At the center of Vogt's ideology is the unitary executive theory, which critics say amounts to an argument that Trump should have wide latitude to do whatever he wants. In other words, the strongman state, the authoritarian. Vogt's unique combination of loyalty and knowledge of how the government actually works makes him perhaps the most powerful person in Washington, not named Donald Trump. If you see a Republican politician or member of the Trump administration talking about the deep state or the regime, there's an almost 100% chance they know his work. Nobody in D.C. has a better grip on the numbers and the management process of the federal government than Russ Vogt, says Steve Bannon, Trump's former chief strategist. Quote, Vogt's one of the critical architects of the Trump restructuring of the U.S. government, end quote. This includes Musk, who's been in regular contact with Vogt from the start of the presidential transition and is seen by Vogt allies as the public-facing arm of his agenda. The example of the CFPB showed how this tag team has been working. Musk took the credit for the shutdown, and his Doge team attracted attention from union members. It was Vogt, and by the shutdown, we're talking about the shutdown of CFPB, it was Vogt who quietly did the actual work. On February 8th, his first full day as the CFPB's interim director, because then Vogt was also assigned to be director of the CFPB, Vogt sent an email ordering employees to stop whatever they're doing and inform the Federal Reserve the CFPB wouldn't take any further funding for the year. In the days that follow, he closed the office, canceled the agency's contracts, axed more than 200 employees, and began preparations for far wider layoffs. Quote, he wasn't trying to make it more efficient, Farman says. Quote, they were trying to illegally fire everybody. The article notes that the Trump administration disputes that. Like many committed civil servants, Farman is an idealist who regards her agency's work, protecting consumers against financial scams, big and small, as both apolitical and righteous. Vogt seems to believe the opposite. He says, quote, we want the bureaucrats to be traumatically affected, he said in a speech last year. When they wake up in the morning, we want them to not want to go to work because they are increasingly seen as villains. This was Farman's introduction to her new boss, Russ Vogt, at CFPB. She watched a video recording of that speech, first published by ProPublica. The weekend Vogt took charge. Having that sentiment out in the open, I almost felt better, she says. If he wants to, and I'll substitute the word mess, if he wants to mess with us, he wants to mess with us to get us to quit. Instead, Farmers Union sued, arguing Vogt's actions amounted to a stealth attempt to illegally dismantle the CFPB without congressional approval. Vogt approached his tenure at the OMB, first as deputy director and later as director, with the zeal of an activist. Quote, "The left has innovated over 100 years to create this fourth branch," end quote, "of government," he told the right-wing talk show host Tucker Carlson in a late 2024 interview in recalling his work during the first Trump administration. Quote, "You and I might call it the regime, this administrative state that is unaccountable to the president," end of quote. The notion of a secret regime controlled by what Vogt described as an unholy alliance of lobbyists, corrupt members of Congress, media, elite, and intelligence agencies became popular among members of the far right as a way to explain Trump's ineffectiveness during his first term. As Vogt saw it, the main job of OMB was to tame the bureaucracy, bring them to heel, and do what the president is telling them to do. Perhaps by design, many of the budget office's career staffers felt like they'd stepped into the twilight zone. OMB is an unusual part of the White House in that the career people really believe themselves to be loyal to the civil service, that they are there to serve whoever is in the administration, but that their highest loyalty is to good process, said Sharon Block, who worked at OMB under Biden and is a Harvard Law School professor. Quote, "They would never say we shouldn't do something because it's bad policy. They would say we shouldn't do it because it's not going to work," end of quote. Vogt's approach in the face of this resistance was to ignore it. Quote, "They were willing to flagrantly misread the law," says Kogan, the other former Biden appointee. That's what Trump's OMB was. Well, so here we have the dismantling of USAID, causing the death of hundreds of thousands of individuals, at least 100,000 children. We have the shutdown of the anti-scam agency, which does what? Gives a green light for us to be scammed. I think I get a scam about every 4 days on my phone of some type. And I say to my team, "Is this real? You know, I just got this text message saying that I need to pay up on my driving my car through the automatic highway charge system, and I didn't have an automatic device on my cars." And I'm like, I did drive a couple months ago. Oh, and they're like, no, Senator, it's a scam. We get them all the time. Every one of us, no matter where we've driven, look at it very closely, but be very careful. Do not put your credit card down. You will get the charge in the mail if it's legitimate, and so forth. Why against the law? Shut down an agency overnight and directly cause the death of hundreds of thousands of people with USAID. Why shut down the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which has helped millions of Americans get funding restored to them, and millions more of us will never know that we were spared a scam because they stopped it from happening in the first place? I don't understand how this is possibly good governance in any shape or form. After January 6th, many senior administration officials either resigned or tried to put distance between themselves and Trump. Vogt stayed at the White House and until the very end, then immediately launched his own think tank dedicated to vigorously pushing back, the Center for Renewing America. Vogt wrote in an essay for The Federalist in January 2021, would sustain what he called the counter-assault by linking Trumpism with Christian values. In Project 2025, Vogt suggested that the OMB should give political appointees control over how funding is apportioned to federal agencies. The apportionment process was intended to make sure agencies don't spend money too fast or have it come back to Congress for more. Vogt argued that it should be used to cut wasteful spending and ensure consistency with the President's agenda. And again, you hear those magic words. Essentially, we shut down programs that do not reflect the President's priorities or are not consistent with the President's agenda. It isn't the job for the President to cut programs that have already been authorized by law and funded by law. It is his job under the Constitution to execute those programs. Yes, to influence the next budget. It's the President's budget that starts the whole entire process. And the President can always veto a spending bill he doesn't like. And a President who has majorities of the same party in both chambers exercises huge influence on the next year. But shutting down a program in mid-stride that has been funded by law, that's a constitutional theft of the power of the purse. That is not just a violation of law, it's a violation of the Constitution. And in this case, stupid things were done. Shutting AI down overnight. I say stupid. Stupid doesn't begin to capture the enormity of the trauma inflicted by shutting down programs for HIV/AIDS and tuberculosis and malaria and nutrition and maternal care overnight around the world. Few people have done so much damage and created so many deaths so quickly as the Secretary of State and Elon Musk by putting AID in the wood chipper overnight. And every time now when there is a scam that someone falls prey to, well, it might be a good chance that they can think Russell Vought and Donald Trump because shut down the agency that tried to provide protection and returned so much money. I see that a colleague, Senator Kim, is here, and I yield to the senator from New Jersey for a question.
Thank you, Senator Merkley, for taking time out tonight to shine a very bright light on a very dark problem. Actions by the Trump administration that put your rights and your freedoms at risk. You know, you're talking about USAID and how the Trump administration was putting it through the wood chipper. You know, that's something that resonated with me as that was the place where I started my government service in my career, working at USAID, standing alongside public servants that were proud to be able to serve our country. So, because I wanted to ask you these questions because I'm hearing it from a lot of people in New Jersey who are alarmed by the actions that they see, whether going after our government and our public servants or what we're seeing in the streets across our country. I thought it might be good to talk through some of these questions to dig in deeper and give the people watching at home a sense of what we mean when we see and say that Donald Trump is a threat to our democracy. You know, let's start with a simple but important question of who is the enemy? Or more importantly, who does Donald Trump see as an enemy? In multiple speeches, it's very clear that Donald Trump sees many of his fellow Americans, your friends, your neighbors, you, as the enemy. He calls them